Everything begins in the western lands of the continent of Mahidoro, where 4 years have passed since Emperor Cordion ascended the throne of the Ashur Empire and began conquering all the neighboring kingdoms. Caught in the middle of this terrible whirlwind of war was a mercenary who preferred to hide his past from everyone. He seemed to carry secrets that were incredibly deep. Suddenly, the story flashes back to when young Elric is caught off guard by the sudden announcement that he must be married immediately. Not understanding anything, he questions his father about it, who simply explains that his bride-to-be will be the daughter of Baron Wibben. The father continues with details, saying the young lady is only 16 years old, extremely beautiful, and has a hobby of tending to her garden. Shortly after, the doors to the great meeting hall begin to slowly open before them. Elric's father believes the two make a good match, and that is how, at only 14 years of age, the boy sees his destiny change drastically. He ended up engaged to a young noble without even seeing her face, which left him completely stunned by the entire situation. Elric simply could not process the idea that he was actually about to get married out of the blue. Already dressed for the grand ceremony, he still tries to understand what is happening while observing the massive angel statue in the chapel. At that moment, he wonders why such an important noblewoman from such a distinguished lineage would accept this union. After all, it didn't seem to make sense for someone from high society to marry the heir of a simple merchant family like his. His thoughts are interrupted when the bride finally appears in the hall and greets him with impressive elegance. Elric stands completely paralyzed and blushing as he looks at the young woman's face, only managing to whisper the name, Tyria. She formally introduces herself as Tyria Wibben while walking gracefully toward him in her beautiful wedding gown. The girl's beauty is overwhelming, with shiny golden hair reminiscent of wheat fields and green eyes that sparkle like spring buds. Her skin is extremely fair and delicate, contrasting perfectly with lips as red as cherries. If Elric had to define her in just one sentence, he would say she is a mysterious and incredibly refined young lady. Suddenly, someone taps Elric on the shoulder to remind him to introduce himself, pulling him out of that trance of admiration. A bit awkward, he bows before her and says he hopes they can have a good life together from then on. Although the boy's mind is a total mess with how fast everything is moving, one single clear thought manages to stand out in the middle of the chaos. He realizes that, starting from that solemn moment at the altar, he will spend the rest of his days beside this very special person. Looking back, Elric understands that the overwhelming feeling he had when he saw her was his first love. When it comes time to exchange rings, he feels so shy about the goofy smile trying to escape his face that he has to make an effort to disguise it. He makes a more serious expression just to contain the immense joy he feels inside during the vow. However, focused only on his own happiness, he was completely oblivious to a crucial detail about his bride. Elric didn't even suspect that this entire forced situation could be deeply hurting Tyria's feelings. Time passes, and the scene changes to a night of heavy rain outside the family's grand mansion. Inside one of the rooms, a single lit candle burns slowly in the silence of the night. Elric fidgets restlessly with his wedding ring, still trying to digest how everything happened so fast. He smiles shyly while lying in bed, thinking that such an elegant young lady is now actually his wife. But the memory of his father announcing that the bride would be the daughter of Baron Wibben echoes strongly in his mind. And as the memories of that conversation return, the smile on the young man's face begins to fade. After all, no matter how hard he tries to analyze the situation from every possible angle, none of it seems to make any real sense. Restless in bed, Elric decides to ask the housekeeper directly why a noble would agree to marry the heir of a merchant family. The housekeeper, named Rhonda, looks away and hesitates quite a bit, clearly appearing uncomfortable with that question. Noticing her reaction, Elric insists and begs her to tell him the whole truth once and for all. Rhonda remains silent for a few moments, appearing to struggle internally against the weight of that secret. She finally reveals to the young master that this is nothing more than a pure marriage of convenience. The housekeeper explains that although the Wibben family had a lot of fame and wealth in the past, today they are buried in debt and without funds to survive. Because of this, Elric's father demanded the marriage as a condition to pay off all the noble's debts and provide the necessary financial support. She adds that through this union, the Portman merchant family will finally be able to climb in status and join the nobility. Shocked by the revelation, Elric asks if this means the girl was basically sold to them, receiving only Rhonda's sorrowful silence as an answer. He falls into despair when he realizes the terrible reality behind his marital bliss. Consumed by immense guilt, he begins to question himself in anguish about what his own father was capable of doing. Unable to contain his emotions, Elric opens the bedroom doors with force and leaves the worried housekeeper behind. He begins to run desperately through the castle corridors with an urgent need to give explanations. Everything the boy desires most in that moment of pure despair is to find Tyria to offer his sincere apologies for what happened. He races against time, extremely distressed, looking for any excuse or justification he can give to ease that terrible situation. Exhausted from running, the boy has to rest his hand on the hallway wall while trying to catch his breath. He leans over, completely tired, but his determination to speak with her prevents him from giving up at that moment. With his heart racing and sweat dripping down his face, he continues gasping for air as he approaches her room. Finally, he arrives in front of the large and luxurious decorated doors of the chambers where she is staying. As he touches the wood to open it, Elric notices a small gap and hears a muffled sound coming from inside. Peeking in silence through the crack in the door, he is totally paralyzed to hear small sobs of crying. On the other side, young Tyria has a completely flushed face and is shedding tears of deep sadness. She appears curled up on the floor of the dark room, hugging her own legs while crying softly in her loneliness. The sound of that suffering breaks Elric's heart, and he is in shock to realize the deplorable state of his bride. At the exact moment he sees her crying in such a painful way, the boy decides to take a step back and walk away. That was when he made a drastic decision and a silent promise that he would find a way to annul that unhappy marriage. The scene changes to the next day, where we see Elric's father signing new business documents as calmly as can be. While the man works quietly in his luxurious office, quick and noisy footsteps echo from outside. Suddenly, Elric opens the doors with extreme violence and shouts for his father in a tone of pure revolt. Without any hesitation, the boy demands immediately that that arranged marriage be cancelled once and for all. He confronts his father directly about the fact that Tyria was purchased just to save her family from financial bankruptcy. With eyes full of despair and anguish, the young man begs from the bottom of his heart for his father to change his mind. However, the man only turns slowly and pronounces his son's name in an extremely cold and sharp tone. He stares fixedly at the boy with a terrifying countenance and orders him to stop acting like a spoiled child immediately. His father stands imposingly and reminds his son that they now belong to the nobility and that he needs to start behaving as such. That extremely cold look, devoid of any trace of affection, hits the boy as if it were a physical blow. This makes Elric remember, with much bitterness, the harsh and sad reality in which he had always lived inside that house. After all, he had always carried the weight of being seen by his own father as the son blamed for his mother's passing during childbirth. To the patriarch, Elric was never more than a mere puppet, a tool without his own will, used only to ensure the family's rise. Faced with such coldness and contempt, the boy realizes that there is no more room for dialogue and decides to turn his back on his father for good. He finally accepts the painful truth that he never meant anything more than a mere instrument of interest to his own progenitor. It is in this moment of deep disappointment that he makes a firm decision that he needs to disappear from that house as soon as possible. He would do this both to free the poor girl who was sold for money and to ruin his father's plans for greatness once and for all. For his escape to work, the young man decides to abandon the Portman surname and everything that connected him to that ambitious family. That same night, an extremely heavy rain begins to fall relentlessly over the vast wheat fields of the region. Under the strong storm, the boy begins his escape journey without looking back, carrying only a backpack and a sword at his waist. While walking in the darkness, he still finds himself questioning the real reasons that made Tyria cry so much in that room. Elric wonders if she suffered from having been sold, from leaving her homeland, or if she cried just because she hated the idea of marrying him. But he knows very well that, no matter how hard he tries to find those answers, there is no way to turn back on his decision. With that, he pushes those doubts out of his head and decides to move forward with his escape toward the unknown. Many years pass, and the story takes us to a huge and imposing stone fortress under a gray, stormy sky. A muscular man with grayish hair notices an approach in the area and asks in surprise who is there in the middle of the rain. Upon seeing the mysterious young man standing before him, the man asks if he really came to that fortress to become a mercenary. With a look full of determination and without showing any sign of hesitation, the boy answers that he did in a very firm manner. He then introduces himself using his new war code name and says that from that day on he only answers to Kasha. Completely abandoning his past, he spent 10 long years surviving on the battlefield and brandishing his sword with relentless ferocity. Wandering constantly from one conflict zone to another, he ended up being known everywhere as the feared sword demon. That entire frightening reputation was, in truth, the only secret that remained of that fragile boy who once called himself Elric. Now, he observes the golden horizon after the end of one more violent combat, reflecting on his long journey of blood. Despite his relentless fame, his gaze still carries a deep melancholy about the lonely path he chose to follow. In the distance, a huge enemy troop begins to position itself in combat formation for the next inevitable attack. However, the fearless warrior positions himself completely alone in the canyon to face the advancing opposing army. He wields his heavy, gleaming blade, which shines intensely against the last rays of the sunset. In the blink of an eye, the warrior executes a quick and overwhelming movement, slicing through the enemies with precise strikes. With his face stained with blood, Kasha maintains a cold expression, totally focused on his own survival in the middle of the chaos. The story then takes us inside a busy tavern, full of people chatting happily about the latest events. The owner of the establishment looks surprised toward the entrance upon hearing the doorbell ring softly. He soon gives a warm welcome to the new customer who has just entered the place carrying a walking cane. It is Elric, who now wears common civilian clothes and uses a cane to move around due to his injuries, walking with a serious countenance and a noticeable limp. He crosses the room in silence under the attentive and curious gaze of several customers drinking nearby. Some patrons recognize him immediately and start whispering if he isn't the legendary sword demon who had been missing from the distant battlefields. They seem astonished and wonder if the feared warrior ended up suffering some irreparable injury to his leg to be in that debilitated state. Elric approaches the counter, and the bartender, worried about his state, asks what happened that was serious enough to leave him limping like that. The young man downplays the situation, explaining it was just a small battle incident, something the attendant considers quite common in the life of any veteran fighter. While picking up a newspaper to read, the young man comments calmly that he will have to live with this physical limitation for a good part of his life. Suddenly, Elric squeezes the newspaper paper with extreme force upon coming across a shocking and unexpected piece of news on the page he was reading. The tavern owner notices the drastic mood swing in his customer and calls out to him, startled by that sudden reaction of silent fury. But the young man is completely paralyzed and with eyes reddened by pure indignation focused on the article in the periodical. The news carried precisely the portrait and name of his late father, Hovin Portman, printed in a formal manner in the obituary. Shortly after, the shrill sound of a steam train whistle echoes through the mountains under the golden light of the sunset. The locomotive travels swiftly along the tracks while cutting through the beautiful mountainous landscape of that peaceful region. Sitting comfortably inside his cabin, Elric observes thoughtfully the immensity that passes quickly by the window glass of the train car. He reflects with bitterness on how his late father's face was printed in such a discreet and forgotten corner of that piece of newspaper. The official announcement confirmed the death of Hovin Portman, the person who caused the most painful and traumatic marks in his entire past. Elric remembers when he ran away from home at 14 years of age, and how, deep in his soul, he still held the naive hope that his father would look for him in some way. He recognizes that, for being just a scared and immature boy at the time, that was a childish feeling without much practical sense. However, even looking back today, he still thinks that that glimmer of hope was not entirely unfounded in his child's mind. After all, despite having been treated only as a puppet of interests and his father being the indirect culprit for his mother's passing, there was still an inevitable bond between the two. He knows that, no matter how hard he tried to deny everything with his immense resentment, he was still, in the end, the blood heir of that man. In some corner of his bitter heart, the boy desperately wished that his father had shown at least a single drop of genuine affection for him before the end. But he knows that this was just a childish illusion, and now that the man has died, the very target of his resentment has simply ceased to exist in the world. He feels that today, Only a cowardly version of himself remains, using his father's passing as a mere excuse to return quietly to his childhood home. With his heart taken by regrets and a deep emptiness in his chest, the warrior hears the train brakes screech as it approaches his former hometown. The train finally stops at its final destination at the Wiven station, the exact location where his entire history of suffering began 10 years ago. The wind blows softly through the immense and shiny golden wheat fields under the reddish sky of the sunset. Elric disembarks on the platform and takes a deep breath of the air of his former land, with a look quite melancholic and distant from everything. He walks slowly along the dirt road between the wheat fields, noting that absolutely nothing has changed there after an entire decade of absence. The streets remain peaceful and painted with the reddish tone characteristic of the dry autumn leaves that fall silently from the trees. He sees local residents working in the harvest without any rush in that setting that seemed extremely welcoming, but at the same time very distant from his violent reality of wars. The tranquil atmosphere of the village shows no trace of that unbearable life or death tension that he faced daily on the battlefields. He continues his slow walk, marking the beat with a rhythmic and painful sound of his limping steps hitting the dirt ground. Suddenly, a light, cool breeze touches his face, bringing him a sense of instant peace and a discreet smile on his lips after so long. The immense wheat fields, which were always the greatest symbol of the Wyben family's property, remain completely untouched by the passage of time. This golden vision brings to the surface the happy memories of his youth when he used to play hide-and-seek in a relaxed manner with the other boys of the village. He also remembers with fondness when he was scolded by the housekeepers for coming back with his clothes all covered in dirt after his daily adventures. With every new step taken on that rustic road, the memories of the past seem to resurface before his eyes with impressive clarity and vividness. He mutters thoughtfully about the strength of these memories, trying to understand the contradictory feelings that they still awaken in his wounded chest. But the warrior's slow steps are suddenly interrupted when he spots something unexpected further ahead on the dusty trail. The young man focuses his attentive gaze towards some female voices that begin to echo softly through the middle of the wheat field. He cannot avoid thinking about the sweet Miss Tyria and wondering if she managed to live well and happy during all these years that he was away. Elric smiles, resigned to himself, imagining that someone so beautiful and graceful must surely have already been courted and married to a good, high-class partner. It is at that instant that he notices an extremely delicate hand touching the golden ears of wheat gently, very close to where he is. His eyes widen in absolute shock upon hearing the voice of a maid shout Tyria's name loudly in the middle of the plantation. He turns around, trembling, and sees, a few meters away, Tyria herself carrying a bundle of harvested wheat while a servant runs, worried to try to help her with the weight. The housekeeper is startled to notice the presence of that stranger with a cane watching them and turns with an intrigued and apprehensive expression toward Elric. Elric observes the young lady closely, almost unable to believe that he is before Tyria again after so much time. At that moment, the maid approaches running and shouts, worried, for her mistress while walking hurriedly. The young man is extremely confused, wondering how on earth she could still be living in such a simple way on that farm. Totally incredulous of that situation, Elric asks why she is still there. Tyria, a bit awkward, answers that the reason for her being there is because she still remains his legitimate wife by law. Upon hearing that calm assertion, the young man feels like the biggest fool in the world for all his thoughtless attitudes of youth. He realizes how naive he was to believe that that forced marriage would simply be annulled by his sudden disappearance. After all, if that arranged union could be undone so easily, she would never have been sold to his family from the start. He questions himself for his selfish actions in the past, ended up imprisoning and stealing for good the last drop of freedom from that poor woman. The young man realizes that, in the end, he was incapable of acting in a mature and correct way with the people around him. He realizes that he failed miserably in protecting his own pride and, worse yet, in providing any kind of support or respect to the woman he had married. He sees himself only as a cowardly man for having fled his family responsibilities in such a childish manner. While he spent 10 years fighting and brandishing his sword aimlessly on the battlefields, she endured all the consequences in silence. He wonders how lonely, difficult, and painful her life must have been throughout all these years of total abandonment in the mansion. Although he feels he urgently needs to ask for her forgiveness for everything, the young man begins to doubt his own real intentions. He questions himself if he even has the right to do that, and if she would really be willing to accept the apologies of someone who left her behind. Completely awkward and quite embarrassed, the young man tries to stutter some words to try to start a conversation. Tyria just watches him in absolute silence, maintaining a calm and indecipherable expression under her large straw hat. Without showing any sign of irritation, she suggests in a practical manner that the two go into the house to talk better about the matter. Shortly after, she begins to walk calmly back toward the mansion, allowing him to follow her closely behind on the dirt road. Elric accompanies her in silence, feeling extremely tense and uncomfortable with all that unexpected calm on her part. Deep down, he desperately wished that she would at least get angry or shout at him for all the suffering he caused. After all, her extreme indifference seemed to hide a hurt much worse than any temperamental explosion of anger. While they walk toward the grand property under the reddish sky, he continues questioning himself about what really awaits him from then on. Suddenly, he notices movement coming from the entrance of the house and turns around quickly with a look of surprise. The young man's eyes widen upon noticing a very familiar figure coming out to the main door of the mansion. Tyria continues advancing toward the entrance, while the young man remains a little set back on the dirt road due to his injured leg. She notices the young man's obvious hesitation, interrupts her steps, and asks in a gentle manner if he is not going to accompany her inside. Caught by surprise by the unexpected delicacy in her voice, Elric swallows hard and tries to recover quickly from the shock. He answers that he is already going and grips his cane firmly, quickening his awkward step to try to catch up with her. They finally enter the imposing mansion, and one of the young servants politely asks for them to wait a moment while she goes to call the butler. Tyria waits patiently in the entrance hall, still holding firmly onto the bundle of golden wheat she harvested in the field. The young servant withdraws from there quickly, opening the large internal doors to fulfill the received order. Elric takes advantage of the brief moment of silence to observe in detail the luxurious environment around him. He is impressed to realize that, even after 10 years away, the interior of the imposing mansion remains absolutely identical to what it was before. Each small decorative detail of the place evokes deep and nostalgic memories of his turbulent childhood inside there. Even the exact number of windows and the location of each stain on the walls come to his mind with impressive clarity. Faced with so much nostalgia, and upon realizing that time seems to have simply frozen there, the young man lets out a light and discreet smile. However, his moment of reflection is suddenly interrupted when a firm female voice asks who he is. Elric turns around, surprised, toward that austere voice that sounds extremely familiar to his childhood ears. An elegant woman wearing glasses and formal housekeeper attire approaches slowly and questions with seriousness who he came to visit. The young man is in absolute shock to recognize that the woman before him is none other than Rhonda, his old trusted housekeeper. He realizes that, even after an entire decade, she has not changed absolutely anything in her austere appearance and impeccable posture. With a light smile on his lips, the young man asks in a relaxed manner if she really cannot recognize him. Rhonda watches him with quite a bit of attention, visibly confused by that intimate question coming from a complete stranger with a cane. However, upon focusing her eyes well on the young man's striking features, she finally realizes who he is and widens her eyes in complete shock of recognition. Rhonda is completely stunned and stammers the title of young master while watching the young man smile back with affection. With trembling hands and tears in her eyes, she asks if that man before her is really her dear boy Elric. He hugs her warmly and says in a soft manner that it has been a long time and that he is finally back home. Holding back his tears, the dedicated housekeeper is moved to confirm that the young man she helped raise has returned safe and sound. She comments, astonished, that he has changed so much in these 10 years that it became almost impossible to recognize him at first. The young man smiles gently and agrees that he really has changed quite a bit in this time, making that reaction perfectly understandable. But suddenly, an extremely intriguing thought strikes Elric's mind, leaving him thoughtful and confused. He remembers perfectly when Tyria stated, moments ago, that she remained on the farm because she was his legitimate wife. The young man reflects on the fact of now being a rustic man who spent 10 years fighting on bloody battlefields. Rhonda notices the young man's sudden distraction and asks, worried, if there is something wrong happening with him at that instant. He concludes that his physiognomy has changed so much that even the housekeeper, who cared for him like a mother, had immense difficulty identifying him at first. Knowing this, the young man wonders how it would be possible for his bride to know who he was without any hesitation. Sweat drips down his forehead while he tries to decipher this great mystery that involves Taraya's behavior. He simply cannot understand how the young woman was able to recognize his face at first sight after so much time away. Time passes, and the scene changes to the interior of a luxurious room in the mansion, where the white curtains sway softly with the wind. Tyria appears standing in front of the huge glass window, observing silently the beautiful landscape of the sunset. She follows with attention the conversation between Elric and the housekeeper that occurs right below in the property's garden. The young man feels that he is being watched from up there, turns around quickly, and ends up blushing quite a bit with the situation. Upon noticing that she was caught spying, the young woman recoils, startled, and brings her hand to her chest with a racing heart. She tries to catch her breath while leaning on the wall, and her face becomes completely red with shyness. The story then highlights the large and striking scar that Elric carries on the back of his neck. Besides focusing on his long brown hair and his deep gaze that carries marks of suffering, to Tyria, absolutely nothing seemed to have changed in the essence and gaze of that boy she knew so well in childhood. Later, Elric relaxes in a luxurious hot water bathtub, but he still remains intrigued by the mystery of the recognition. While taking his bath, he tries to find some plausible explanation for how his wife was able to identify him so easily after 10 years. He finally decides to get out of the warm water, causing a light noise upon stepping on the wet floor of the bathroom. The young man wears his white robe and begins to tie the belt, but takes a big scare upon hearing the door open suddenly. He turns his head confused, widening his eyes before the unexpected presence that arises right in front of him. It is Tyria, who enters the environment quietly, wearing only a white towel wrapped around her body after her bath. Upon noticing his presence there in the same private space, her cheeks turn red with shame instantly. Desperate with the discovery, the girl tries to cover herself more and starts to stutter several apologies for the misunderstanding. Seeing that she is about to cry from so much embarrassment, Elric tries to calm her down in a hurry so she does not panic. He gestures nervously and asks her not to shed tears because of that embarrassing situation. But the tense and shy atmosphere between the two newlyweds seems to only increase with every second of silence in that steamy room. To make the situation worse, a young maid with red hair opens the door holding a basket of clothes and lets out an ear-splitting scream upon seeing the intimate scene. In complete panic with the catch, the servant throws everything on the floor and runs out as fast as she can through the mansion's hallways. She screams desperately for help from outside, unable to understand what on earth is happening inside that room. In an extremely quick reaction to protect his wife from curious eyes, Elric pulls Tyria close and hugs her firmly. However, this unexpected and sudden physical contact leaves both with faces even redder with pure shame. With eyes full of tears from the shock, the young woman can only manage to stammer her maid's name in panic. Trying to get around the situation in any way, the young man tries to invent a lame excuse that he only held her so she wouldn't fall on the slippery floor. The story then transports us back to the dark times of war on the Shevr defense line, where the 5th Guard Regiment is positioned. One of the fearless fighters observes the horizon with a sharp and relentless gaze in the middle of the strong rain falling. From the enemy side emerges the feared knight of the Imperial Army's vanguard, LeBron, leading the elite assault group with a macabre smile on his face. With war cries echoing everywhere, the troops receive orders to advance with everything to annihilate the local defense forces. LeBron taunts the adversaries by shouting, raising his massive sword and guaranteeing that he will hack each one of them without any mercy. In an extremely brutal attack, the powerful enemy commander begins to knock down several guards at once, spreading blood across the wet earth. Desperate before such disparity of power, the surviving soldiers shout that it is impossible to defeat that armored warrior. Without another viable alternative to avoid a massacre, the officers order the immediate withdrawal of all units behind the defensive line. But contrary to all that generalized panic, the fearless Kasha walks calmly toward the danger with his heavy sword resting on his shoulder. The enemy soldiers watch the mysterious warrior from a distance and wonder if he is just another insignificant mercenary hired by Shavor. Completely oblivious to the adversaries, whispers, the young man adopts his combat stance and raises his heavy sword. Kasha maintains his cold gaze focused on the opponents, demonstrating an impressive calm before the imminent battle. Without losing time, one of the fearless Imperial soldiers advances fiercely toward him with his sword held high and a sadistic smile on his face. However, the protagonist blocks the attack with extreme ease and already prepares to deliver a devastating counterattack. He holds his massive blade with absolute firmness, maintaining an imperturbable expression while dominating the confrontation. With a precise and lethal movement, he hits the enemy's neck, making the blood gush intensely in the middle of the rain. The injured soldier drops his weapon and falls to his knees on the ground, completely defeated by the young man's overwhelming power. Kasha spins his sword quickly and decapitates the opponent with a single clean and merciless cut. The bloodied helmet of the soldier rolls through the mud before his companions, spreading panic among the Imperial troops. The other soldiers who watch the scene stand paralyzed by pure terror and begin to break out in a cold sweat before that monstrous strength. Standing beside the fallen body, the warrior introduces himself solemnly as Kasha, the legendary mercenary knight of Shavor. He challenges the remaining enemies to advance if they have the courage, guaranteeing that he will hack down to the last of them without any hesitation. But suddenly, a chill runs down his spine when he feels a deadly threat approaching quickly. The protagonist reacts at the same instant and activates his mana shield to try to protect himself from the surprise attack. However, a powerful projectile pierces his protected barrier with violence and hits his left knee squarely. Feeling excruciating pain, the young man falls to his knees and uses his own sword as support so as not to collapse on the bloody ground. Kasha grinds his teeth and looks up with much difficulty, trying to identify the origin of that devastating shot. At the top of a nearby cliff, two mysterious silhouettes observe silently the unfolding of the battle down below. It is a duo with eccentric clothing and masks, where the woman holds a sniper rifle that is still smoking. The young man wakes up startled and with wide eyes, letting out a sigh of pure panic after reliving that terrible nightmare. Elric sits up quickly in bed, bathed in cold sweat and wielding a knife in a defensive manner against the void. He breathes, gasping for air with his heart racing, still trying to get rid of the traumatic memories of the war. The young man looks at the knife in his trembling hands while trying to get his bearings and calm his combat instincts. Little by little, the sunlight that invades the imposing and luxurious room begins to bring a sense of reality to the environment. He finally realizes that he is no longer on the battlefield and that he managed to return in safety to his home. Suddenly, knocks on the door startle him and make him point his weapon in the direction of the noise by pure reflex. From outside, a polite voice asks if the young master is already awake, while he remains tense on the huge bed. Elric hesitates for a brief moment and maintains silence, trying to control his uneven breathing before answering. He finally answers in a contained manner that yes, confirming that he is already awake. While saying he just woke up, the young man hides the knife quickly behind his back so as not to raise suspicions. One of the dedicated servants enters the room bringing a wooden basin full of water so that he can wash himself. The protagonist remembers that as soon as he asked for cold water to clean himself, a basin overflowing with freezing water was delivered to him without delay. He dresses in incredibly soft and comfortable clothes, feeling as if he were barely wearing anything in comparison to the heavy armor of before. Upon looking at himself in the mirror leaning on his cane, Elric reflects that living surrounded by so much luxury seems like a reward he does not deserve. The young man tries to force a smile before his own reflection, but the resulting expression sounds strange and unnatural to him. He begins to walk slowly and wonders if all that time of suffering on the battlefield ended up turning his face into stone. The housekeeper Rhonda opens the door and compliments the young master's look, suggesting shortly after that they start the day with a good breakfast. She stands tall with her impeccable and elegant posture as always, waiting for him to accompany her. Upon noticing the young man's limping walk, the housekeeper asks, worried, what happened to his leg, and he invents the lie that he ended up falling from a steep hill by pure distraction. In his mind, the protagonist remembers how he was injured in the war and recognizes that he could never tell that a bullet remained lodged in his knee so as not to cause unnecessary worries. Rhonda comments, amused, that he continues as prone to accidents as in the past, making the young man laugh awkwardly and remember the embarrassing misunderstanding of the previous day. While the two walk through the mansion's corridors, soft footsteps begin to echo and a long-awaited figure appears in their direction. The delicate profile and long golden hair of the young bride are revealed under the soft light that enters through the windows. Tyria appears before him in a stunning manner and asks with sweetness if he managed to have a good night's sleep. However, the sight of his wife makes the young man remember instantly the moment he saw her coming out of her bath wrapped only in a towel. Completely embarrassed and with his face red, he can barely formulate a decent answer after being called a pervert because of that incident. The young maid Marie points her finger dramatically and screams that he is a true deviant, while Tyria stands very awkwardly in the background. Without patience for that scandal, Rhonda hits Mary's head with a strong tap and scolds her harshly for having been spying on someone else's bathhouse. While dragging the noisy maid away from there by her collar, the housekeeper wishes politely that the young man has a pleasant stay in the mansion. Feeling somewhat uncomfortable with the warm reception, Elric clears his throat to try to dissipate the heavy atmosphere. He forces a friendly smile and wishes a good morning to his wife, commenting in a relaxed manner that he managed to sleep very well. While observing the cozy environment of the dining room, the young man notices Mary's absence and asks the name of the new maid for not remembering her from his last visit. However, he almost spits out what he was eating and slaps his hand on the table out of pure shock when Tyria mentions the incident where the maid called him a pervert. Desperate to end the subject, the protagonist gestures frantically with his hands and insists that she does not need to worry about that. He rests his hand firmly on the handle of his cane, trying to regain his composure before the embarrassing situation. With a visibly flushed face, Elric tries to explain himself, saying it was just a silly curiosity for never having seen the girl before. Tyria stares at him with a half-closed and extremely sharp look, appearing not to be totally convinced by that hurried excuse. An embarrassing silence soon settles in the environment while the couple begins to have breakfast, side by side. The young bride savors the meal with tranquility and chews calmly, appearing oblivious to the tension that hangs in the air. Suddenly, she opens her mouth to talk about a delicate subject, leaving the young man instantly on alert. Taking advantage of the opening, Elric takes the initiative and decides to address once and for all the terrible misunderstanding of the previous day. Tyria asks shyly if he is referring to what happened in the bathhouse, feeling her cheeks heat up at the same time. The young man tries to stutter a formal apology, but she interrupts him quickly with a nervous gesture to end the conversation. Still quite embarrassed, the young lady asks only for him to concentrate on eating and finish his breakfast soon. Tyria looks away and squeezes her own dress with trembling hands, completely awkward with that entire intimate situation. She remains in absolute silence with her face flushed, unable to face her husband directly in the eyes. Feeling the atmosphere become increasingly heavy, the protagonist scratches the back of his neck and mentally curses his own idea of bringing the subject up. He remembers how he was wearing only a robe in the bathhouse and realizes that he ended up exposing himself too much. Elric recalls with bitterness the countless deep scars that cover his body, questioning himself as she ended up being shocked by the marks of his violent past in the war. The two continue eating in an almost ear-splitting silence, where only the sound of cutlery against the plates can be heard. The young man deeply regrets not having simply ignored what occurred, feeling that that embarrassing atmosphere will end up driving both of them crazy. To escape from there as quickly as possible, he begins to stuff food into his mouth in an extremely hurried and almost desperate way. With his cheeks totally full, the young man cleans his mouth in a hurry while his wife watches him in complete shock with that sudden lack of manners. Giving a thumbs up, the young man announces with his mouth full that he is already leaving and wishes for her to finish enjoying the meal. He stands up quickly and leaves the dining room, closing the wooden door right behind him with a soft click. Tyria watches the closed door for a few moments and lets out a shy sigh before her husband's unexpected attitude. With her face still red, she looks at the sunny window and wishes in thought that he has a pleasant day. Upon stepping into the main hall after breakfast, Elric notices that the immense Portman property is already in full operation and full of servants working. Under the attentive guidance of the housekeeper Rhonda, the young man begins to greet each of the house employees, who receive him with sincere smiles and a lot of sympathy. However, one of the servants asks in a cheeky way if it is true that he tried to attack the mistress yesterday, making another employee scold him, saying that the two are married and praising the young master's virility. Suddenly, young Marie emerges furious in the middle of the hallway and screams at the top of her lungs that the protagonist is nothing more than a big pervert. She rails indignantly for all the other employees to wake up and stop defending the young man's suspicious attitudes. The young maid continues her scandal, saying that he disappeared for 10 years only to return with this type of behavior, but she is interrupted when a firm hand holds her shoulder. It is the elderly Aldio who appears smiling and asks for her not to be so hard on the young master, for her still being too young to understand these things. The experienced employee explains naturally that the main duty of any noble is to ensure a legitimate heir for the family's lineage. Aldio argues enthusiastically that Elric was only fulfilling his marital obligations faithfully in the bathhouse, and that he proved to be a true noble by not forgetting his duties even after a decade away. The young man is completely mortified with the embarrassing conversation, while Marie continues protesting with shouts that he is the worst of deviants. The friendly gentleman ignores the girl's protests and asks with expectation if the young master finally returned home for good, making Elric let out a very awkward laugh. Holding the handle of his cane firmly, the protagonist reflects in silence that, in truth, he still has not made any decision about his future. He knows that the serious injury to his knee will force him to remain in the mansion for some time, but he questions how he could act as the legitimate lord of that beautiful property, surrounded by golden wheat fields after so many years away. Trying to change the subject, Elric warns that he needs to settle some commitments now and that they will talk better later, receiving a respectful nod from Aldio, who celebrates his return. Shortly after, the young master orders the experienced employee to prepare the carriage for his immediate departure. A short time later, the vehicle begins to move softly along the dirt road that cuts through the immensity of the farm's golden fields. From the middle of the wheat plantation, Tyria observes in silence the carriage moving away slowly toward the property's exit. She holds her large straw hat against the soft breeze of the day, maintaining a thoughtful and melancholic gaze while observing the horizon. Seen from above, the carriage follows its lonely path along the road surrounded by the vibrant colors of autumn that cover the region. The vehicle finally stops at an isolated point on the hill, and Elric gets out to walk slowly with the aid of his cane. The young man observes the silent landscape with an expression loaded with melancholy and mutters to himself that it really has been a long time. He stops before the imposing stone tomb of Hovin Portman and whispers with deep sadness the word, "Father," staring at the headstone under the brilliant light of the sky. Before the headstone, the protagonist reflects silently that he used to carry a deep resentment toward his late father. However, he confesses that he never wished for the reunion between them to happen in that cold and melancholic manner. Hovin Portman had been an extremely determined man who raised the family's lineage from mere merchants to the most important guild in Wyvern, but his relentless coldness also earned him countless enemies throughout his life. The young man questions himself if his father ever once gave him a sincere smile or a single word of affection, concluding that he should have lived a little longer if he wanted to maintain his villainous posture until the end. He fixes his eyes on the coat of arms carved into the funerary monument and laments silently that his father passed away so soon. With a light sigh, Elric decides to look away from the tomb and prepares to turn his back on that place under the blue sky. The young man admits to himself that he no longer carries the hurt and resentment of the past that used to torment his heart. The young man then turns slowly and calls the attention of Aldio, who was waiting patiently a little further behind. He asks directly how his father passed away, and the loyal employee answers that the cause was a serious heart disease that afflicted him. Elric is surprised to learn that the late man hid the truth about his health state until the end, with only the personal doctor and Aldio himself knowing the situation. The employee continues the account, explaining that, upon noticing the proximity of his final days, Hovin dedicated all his strength to closing and liquidating his businesses. With a light, ironic smile, the young man comments that he finds the employee a curious figure and asks what he saw in that man, so cold to maintain such loyalty. Without hesitation, Aldio smiles back and answers in a humorous manner that he did everything for money, questioning what other reason he could have. The protagonist stares at him with suspicion and observes that he still has not asked him the most important question of all. He refers to the fate of all the assets and wealth that the late man liquidated hurriedly before his premature death. The young man maintains a serious expression while waiting for the revelation about the whereabouts of the family's immense fortune. The elderly employee then reveals that all the inheritance accumulated by his father was bequeathed entirely to him, the legitimate heir. The carriage resumes its march and advances slowly along the dirt road that cuts through the beautiful forest with autumn leaves. Already settled inside the vehicle, Elric asks the coachman if his father really did not leave any formal written will. Aldio answers that the late man was not the type who would do something like that and confirms that there are only some written instructions about the sharing, offering to show them if he has any curiosity. Gripping his cane firmly, the young man listens to the employee admit that the late man's true intentions remain a great mystery to everyone. The coachman adds that the matter was treated with a coldness never seen before by the old boss, leaving the protagonist quite thoughtful. While the carriage crosses the golden plantation, the elderly man advises the young man to take all the necessary time to reflect on the fate of the inheritance. The young man focuses his red gaze on the landscape and begins to connect the dots about his family's current situation. An intriguing questioning arises in his mind while he observes the wheat plantation through the vehicle's window. Elric wonders for what reason his wife still remains in the mansion, since the arranged marriage should have been annulled after his long absence of 10 years. Aldio comments from outside that marriage was purely political, functioning as a commercial transaction disguised as a union between two noble families. The young man questions if that fact would be sufficient justification, but is interrupted by the elderly man who remembers a very important detail he had forgotten to mention. He reveals that the Portman lineage has now ascended to the title of hereditary barony and that this prestigious honor will be transferred to the young man as soon as he assumes the inheritance. The employee emphasizes that all the fortune belongs exclusively to him by right and not to the young lady who lives on the property. The carriage finally parks in front of the main entrance of the imposing and luxurious mansion of the family. Upon getting out of the transport, Elric reflects that, if money were Tyria's only motivation, she would have left a long time ago, considering that a year has already passed since the passing of his father. He concludes that, if she wanted to, the young lady could have claimed the fortune as an agent and left there, which proves that her remaining on the property was an entirely personal choice. The young master asks the coachman if he knows the reason that led his wife to make such an unusual decision. Aldio sighs and explains that the young mistress is an extremely reserved woman, confessing that they were never close enough to share intimate confidences. He describes the bride as a person of haughty nobility and difficult to approach, making it impossible for a simple servant to question her motives. Elric agrees that she seems to be someone complicated to deal with and highlights that she is still a complete stranger to him, since the two only saw each other in person a single time. The elderly man gives a light pat on the horse and ponders with wisdom that, in truth, practically every marriage of convenience begins exactly in that manner. The young man begins to climb the stone steps with difficulty, resting all the weight of his injured body on his cane. At the top of the stairs, he comes across Tyria leaning on one of the imposing columns, appearing quite shy with his approach. The young lady hides her reddened face under the brim of her large hat, demonstrating the obvious embarrassment she still feels by her husband's presence. She squeezes her own hands firmly against her dress, revealing her extreme shyness and internal agitation with the sudden encounter. With hesitant steps, the young bride begins to walk slowly toward the residence's entrance. Upon noticing her presence, Elric takes the initiative and asks in a gentle manner if she just returned from her stroll. Surprised by the approach, Tyria blushes intensely and inquires with surprise when it was that the young man arrived from his trip. She holds a small bag of wheat and explains shyly that she just returned from her routine of work in the fields. The protagonist feels his own face heat up with his wife's physical proximity and tries to disguise his enormous nervousness before her. He suggests in a friendly manner that the two entered the mansion together, and the young woman agrees immediately with a light nod of her head. The couple begins to climb the luxurious internal staircase side by side, maintaining a silence loaded with shyness and tension. Elric observes her from the corner of his eye while mentally cursing his own mouth for always creating extremely strange and uncomfortable dialogues. While walking beside Tyria, Elric notices that, even dressed in simple work clothes, she carries an innate and extremely elegant air of nobility. He catches himself thinking if the young lady already possessed that striking and haughty presence 10 years ago when they married. The young man remembers vaguely the image of the bride on the day of their wedding when she seemed a shy and radiant young noblewoman. Suddenly, a loud noise brings him back to reality and makes him jump in shock in the middle of his thoughts. Due to his injured leg, The protagonist ends up tripping in an awkward way and startles his wife, who asks, worried, if he is okay. Elric strikes his cane against the ground with force to regain his balance and avoid an embarrassing fall. He forces a yellow smile and lies, saying that he is great, claiming that his legs just failed for an instant due to the long walk, while he questions himself for how long she watched him walk in that limping way. The young man apologizes for not being able to carry the bag of wheat for her due to his injured leg while they continue climbing the stairs. Tyria answers that it is okay, and that she already got used to that, which makes the protagonist feel quite ashamed and awkward for having abandoned his wife for so long and now offering late apologies. The young bride stares at him with her striking golden eyes, transmitting a calm and deep seriousness in her gaze. She explains that she meant she got used to the heavy work for having learned everything directly from the late patriarch of the Portman family. Surprised by the revelation, Elric mutters that acting in a rigorous way and demanding the most from others was indeed the characteristic way of his late father. The young man recalls that the patriarch Hovin Portman was a tireless man who made a point of personally inspecting each sector of his businesses, including the vast wheat plantations. He reflects that, as his father had liquidated all the other ventures, leaving only that farm, it was perfectly natural that he had transferred all the administration of the lands to Tyria. The steps of both finally silence when the two interrupt the climb and stop at the top of the mansion's hallway. With a serious countenance, Elric hesitates for an instant before bringing up a subject with the young lady about a quite personal theme. Standing right before the imposing portrait of the patriarch Hovin, the young man asks with curiosity how his father's days were before he passed away. Tyria answers in a cold and direct manner that she only learned the farm services with him, confessing that she does not remember almost anything besides the professional obligations. Upon hearing his wife's distant answer, the protagonist grips the handle of his wooden cane with even more force. He finds the courage and asks if, by chance, his father ever once mentioned his name or asked about him during all that time. The young lady answers in a short and simple manner that no, leaving the young man with a light, sad smile on his lips before the confirmation of paternal coldness. He reflects silently that that was a peculiar combination of an insensitive father with a woman of few words, making any dialogue between them purely commercial. The young man looks away and accepts the sad reality about the distant relationship he maintained with his late father. Tyria asks for permission to withdraw and return to her daily duties, leaving the young man confused for believing that she had already finished work for that day. She clarifies that she still needs to review all the paperwork in the office, making Elric feel astonished with the amount of obligations under her responsibility. The young master asks, surprised, if she really takes care of the wheat farm during the day and still reviews bureaucratic documents at night, and she confirms shyly that yes. The young lady says goodbye, saying she will see him again only at dinner time, and he only nods in silence while watching her move away. The young man remains motionless in the hallway, following his wife's departure with a gaze loaded with anguish. At that instant, Elric is invaded by a deep feeling of guilt upon realizing that all that workload should be his responsibility, feeling ashamed for having lived in a selfish way while she suffered in his place. He reflects that his conscience would be much lighter if she at least showed some resentment or grudge against him, but the young lady never uttered a single word of complaint throughout all these years. Feeling the weight of his thoughts, the protagonist begins to limp slowly toward the mansion's office. Suddenly, a strong thud coming from a side hallway calls his attention and makes him stop immediately. He comes across the clumsy Marie fallen on the floor after tripping and knocking over a wooden box full of old letters, leaving her in complete despair. Marie cries without knowing what to do before that entire mess, while the young man watches her with a confused expression. He kneels to help her collect the scattered paperwork and takes the opportunity to ask what all that sealed correspondence is about. The servant answers that they are old letters sent to her mistress, making Elric pick up one of the envelopes to analyze with more attention. The young master is quite impressed to notice the enormous amount of correspondence kept in that box. However, the young man's expression changes instantly and his eyes widen upon recognizing the sender of one of the pieces of correspondence. He realizes that the letters were sent by the Weaven family, remembering the terms of the political marriage agreement that sealed Tyria's fate. The protagonist opens the letter and begins to read attentively the content written by the young lady's father. In the text, Baron Wibben insists for his daughter to give up waiting for a husband who will never return and return home, even offering a new marriage to spare her from more suffering. Elric realizes that his father had transferred all the family's fortune to his name, leaving his daughter-in-law without a single cent even after 10 years of exclusive dedication to the Portman property. He rests the letter on the office's wooden table, recognizing that if his wife had taken all the inheritance for herself, it would only be a fair payment for her years of effort. The young man sits at the table and rests his head in his hands, questioning himself if Tyria's true reason for having remained there was only to preserve the legacy left by his late father-in-law. However, he still cannot understand the reason for her having dedicated so much to a cause that would not yield her any financial reward. Elric remains sitting in the luxurious office chair, completely engrossed in trying to uncover his wife's real intentions. He focuses his deep red eyes on the void, determined to find the answers he seeks about the young lady's behavior. He concludes that if her objective were purely the material inheritance, she would have already taken possession of all the assets and left the mansion about a year ago, right after the patriarch's death. The young man leans over the documents scattered on the table, trying to decipher the mystery that involves the young lady's devotion. He opens one of the desk drawers and comes across a pile of letters kept, concluding silently that his suspicions were correct. The young man analyzes the correspondence and realizes that the letters sent by the Wibben family began to arrive exactly a year ago. He notes that all the messages had the same objective of collecting the inheritance that his father had saved for him, and notes that his wife probably never answered any of them since the last letters went as far as to beg for an answer. Elric lets out a long sigh mixed with a bitter smile before that entire surprising situation. He realizes that Tyria was protecting the Portman family's heritage faithfully for an heir whose return was uncertain and never guaranteed. Knowing that not even the loyal coachman Aldio knew the existence of those collections from his bride's family, the young man concludes that the young lady must have made a tremendous effort to hide the entire truth. The protagonist realizes with sorrow that his wife had been facing that difficult battle completely alone throughout the entire previous year. He observes Tyria working from afar in the fields and recognizes the impressive strength and determination of that young lady, so reserved. The young master reflects that he would not have the slightest right to blame her if she had simply taken the fortune for herself, questioning himself in thought why she chose to tread a path of so many trials. Meanwhile, in her private chambers, the young mistress settles before the vanity and begins to get ready for the meeting requested by her husband. She arranges her blonde hair delicately and ties a light satin ribbon bow behind her head. Wearing an elegant dark blue dress with lace details, Tyria observes her own reflection in the mirror with a quite serious and thoughtful expression. Suddenly, young maid Marie emerges in the room with red cheeks of excitement and celebrates that the moment finally arrived. The servant joins her hands and screams enthusiastically that the young master finally took the initiative to request a meeting alone with his wife. The girl makes a funny face and mutters that, although his behavior in the bathhouse was unforgivable, she remembers the words of wisdom from butler Aldio. Marie insists out loud that giving an heir to the family would also be wonderful for her mistress herself, leaving Tyria completely red and confused with such boldness. Unable to contain her exaggerated excitement, the maid begins to jump with joy through the room with bouncy little steps. She advances suddenly and grabs the skirt of her mistress's luxurious blue dress with a lot of force. Kneeling on the rug, Marie begs dramatically for her mistress to follow the experienced butler's recommendations. The maid sheds theatrical tears and warns that the young man is a shameless deviant who can run away from home at any moment for having abandoned her in the past, insisting that the best thing to do is for the two to get closer once and for all. With a hilarious and exaggerated expression, the servant screams with all her strength for the young lady to run to bed with her husband to order a baby soon. Marie begins to make outlandish plans to have 2 babies, identical to her mistress, to avoid that any of them inherit the young master's runaway and perverted personality, causing an enormous cold sweat of shame in Tyria. Fortunately for the young mistress, firm knocks on the door interrupt the limitless prattle of the clumsy maid. From outside, Butler Aldio asks politely if she is already ready for the commitment, and she answers in a hurry that she is already leaving the room. Tyria and the butler's firm steps begin to echo through the imposing wooden hallway while they head to the meeting room. The young woman descends the stairs, questioning herself anxiously about what the subject of the conversation would be, since that was the first time he had requested a private meeting with her. With soft movements, Aldia holds the golden handles and opens the large double doors for the young mistress's entry. The experienced employee announces solemnly the mistress's arrival while Elric waits patiently sitting at the table. The young master, who was enjoying a cup of tea calmly before the large sunny window, raises his gaze and wishes her a warm welcome. Tyria enters the elegant tea room with calm steps and a countenance slightly flush with shyness. The sound of her shoe heels echoes through the environment while she approaches the tea table, prepared to receive them. The young man takes one last sip of his drink in a thoughtful manner while observing his wife settling in front of him. Seen from above, the duo positions themselves in the center of the imposing hall, decorated with classic furniture and bathed by sunlight. Without beating around the bush, Elric places the letter on the table and offers sincere apologies for having opened the correspondence without authorization, explaining that he found them by chance fallen in the middle of the mess made by the maid. He touches a sealed envelope and asks in a direct manner if he could question her about the content of those mysterious letters. Tyria widens her eyes and lets out a light gasp of surprise upon realizing that her great secret was discovered by her husband. She lowers her head immediately, letting the shadow of her hair cover her face taken by sudden anguish. In silent panic, the young lady fears that the young man might misunderstand her true intentions and start seeing her as a greedy woman without scruples interested only in the inheritance. The young man breaks the silence, commenting calmly that he discovered that she spent the entire last year ignoring solemnly all those collections from his family. He stares at her in a serious manner and confesses that he only called her there to obtain an answer for the reason for her having protected his inheritance with such tenacity, even without having any guarantee that he would return alive one day. Elric highlights that she could easily have taken possession of all the wealth for herself without anyone being able to stop her or judge her for it. Deep down, the young man understands that to her, he was nothing more than a complete stranger after a decade of total distancing. He reflects that the insistence of that unknown young lady in safeguarding the patrimony of an absent husband remained an incomprehensible mystery to his mind. He asks for her to reveal the truth about the reason for having refused to return to her homeland in Wibben even before her father's insistence. With her face partially shadowed and lips closed, the young lady mutters the family's surname in a firm and solemn manner. She raises her head with determination and declares with her striking golden eyes that her official name now is Tyria Portman. The young lady states with pride and authority that she is no longer the mistress of Wibben, but rather the legitimate mistress and protector of the entire Portman property. Without giving time for any response, she stands up abruptly and apologizes for needing to withdraw in a hurry for still having many pending obligations on the farm. The young mistress turns her back and moves away with quick and decided steps through the room, leaving her tea untouched on the table. Elric remains sitting in the chair with a drop of sweat on his forehead, completely stunned and without reaction before his wife's imposing and unexpected attitude. He observes in silence the void left by the young lady before the sunny window, trying to digest the impact of that powerful declaration of loyalty. Elric asks his wife why she decided to protect his part of the inheritance even without having any guarantee that he would one day return alive, highlighting that she could very well have kept all the fortune for herself. Tyria hesitates for an instant and begins to stammer shyly, trying to find the right words to answer her husband's questioning. She swallows hard and gets intensely flushed cheeks while trying to contain her nervousness before the young man. Raising her gaze with firmness, the young lady stares at him with her striking golden eyes and answers with simplicity that she acted that way for being his wife. Meanwhile, in the office, Elric holds a small knife and jabs it thoughtfully against the room's wooden wall panel. Sitting in his chair, the young master reflects in silence about everything that happened and his companion's real motivations. He remembers the young lady's strong declaration affirming that she now belongs to the Portman family and that she will assume the responsibility and duty of protecting that property. The sound of the blade clashing against the wall echoes through the silent room while he continues lost in his thoughts. Elric questions himself if the true hidden feeling behind that cold and formal answer was only the sense of duty of a noble woman. He realizes that she protected the entire remaining patrimony not out of greed, but to fulfill her obligation, an altruistic attitude that makes him remember instantly an old acquaintance from the past. The young man brings to memory the figure of Elvis Graham, a man who marked his military trajectory deeply. Elric recalls that he met Elvis on the battlefield as the third son of an influential family that had hired him as a mercenary during a territorial war. Despite having achieved victory with few casualties, the triumph was not complete, as Elvis ended up suffering serious injuries that left him permanently in a wheelchair. Even incapacitated from fighting, the noble maintained a haughty posture and stated that he needed to continue fulfilling his social role. He used to say that those born into nobility carried the burden of setting an example for others, and that war was only the stage for him to exercise his duty. At the time, Elric even questioned him if it was contradictory to act that way, being only the son of a concubine and half-commoner. With a sarcastic smile, Elvis answered that he preferred to see himself as half noble, and that by fulfilling half of his obligations, he ended up sacrificing half of his own body. Fulfilling what he had promised, the man retired from combat to live in a quiet manner and ended up marrying a few years later. Back to reality, the protagonist removes the blade from the wooden wall with a firm movement. He mutters to himself about the weight of the words responsibility and duty that so much seem to guide his wife's actions. Although he recognizes that he will never be able to repay Tyrius 10 years of sacrifice, the young man knows he is not totally tied hand and foot before that situation. Aware that the young lady's greedy family will continue sending correspondence collecting the inheritance, he deduces that their apparent physical absence is due to some impediment and not for lack of desire. Knowing that his wife will never reveal her deepest feelings, even if he insists on the subject, Elric decides to act on his own. Fortunately, the young man plans an alternative path to discover the entire truth behind that story once and for all. With that, a carriage travels toward the luxurious property of the Wyvern family. Elric arrives before the iron gates of the imposing mansion and concludes that the best strategy at the moment is to make a direct approach. The young master walks elegantly through the garden, recognizing the grandeur of the place and feeling confident for the confrontation that is to come. Meanwhile, from inside the residence, the hosts have already been informed of the visit and comment with disdain about the young man's audacity in finally showing his face. Baron Weben and his wife walk hurriedly through the hallways, distilling poison against their son-in-law and calling him an unusable wretch of humble origin. The Baroness complains furiously that he should have disappeared forever and accuses the young man of having returned only to sniff around and steal their daughter's inheritance. With a gloomy and greedy look, the Baron worries about the possibility of the young man trying to claim his legal rights over the fortune left by Hoven. The couple of nobles follow with quick steps toward the visiting room to confront the unwanted visitor. They walk side by side through the luxurious rooms, determined not to allow the young man to keep the assets of the Portman family. The Baron rails irritably, labeling his son-in-law as a piece of self-interested trash who only cares about money. His wife agrees fully and adds that the young man wasted an entire decade of Tyrius life, remembering dramatically all the high cost and effort they took to raise the young lady. The greedy noble focuses his attention on the valuable inheritance left by the late patriarch of the Portmans. They march decided, convinced that they need to confiscate that fortune to compensate for all the supposed damages they suffered. With a sudden movement, the Baron holds the golden handle and opens the meeting room door. Upon entering, they come across Elric elegantly dressed and leaning on his cane, waiting patiently for his in-laws' arrival. The young master bows politely and introduces himself formally as Elric Portman, offering sincere apologies for the long delay in coming to visit them. Sitting at the table with his arms crossed, the Baron comments with irony about the 10-year disappearance, while his wife pretends to understand the situation with a fake smile behind her fan. Without losing time with formalities, the young man mentions directly that he had the opportunity to read the letter sent by them to his mansion. The father-in-law finds it ridiculous that the young man only read the message now, but insists on accelerating the conversation, stating that he sent the letter out of pure paternal concern for his daughter's abandonment. He accuses Elric of being a shameless person for having abandoned Tyria after the Wyben family helped elevate the Portmans to the status of nobility, mentioning greedily the great inheritance left by the late patriarch. The Baron lets out a laugh of mockery and insults openly his son-in-law's humble origin, ironizing the fact that he returned crippled and questioning his capacity and right to manage any fortune. He clears his throat and says in an arrogant manner that, as the inheritance had been managed exclusively by Tyria, the young man clearly has no aptitude for business. On the other side of the table, the couple of nobles throws their cards on the table in a direct manner, demanding the delivery of the entire Portman fortune as financial compensation for the abandonment of their daughter. The patriarch of the Wibbons insists that his son-in-law is shameless for wanting to claim the assets and doubts that he would give any useful destination to the money inherited from his father. Hiding her greedy smile behind her fan, the Baroness supports her husband and adds that the young man has no competence to manage the lands, lamenting falsely the suffering of her daughter. With gloomy and malicious looks, the couple of nobles concludes that the best solution is that they assume total control of the fortune, guaranteeing that they will give excellent use for every cent of the inheritance. Faced with all those absurd demands, Elric only lets out a long and heavy sigh. He feels his eyes burn with fury and thinks about how that situation is repugnant, realizing that, behind all the chatter, the only real goal of that couple is to steal the inheritance left by his late father now that Tyria is alone. The young man concludes that the two saw the perfect opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of someone else's patrimony without caring minimally about the well-being of their own daughter while trying to usurp the lands only to fill their pockets with gold. Taken by a deep disgust, the young master realizes that he can no longer bear to hear even a single word coming from such disgusting people. Elric closes his eyes to breathe deeply and warns coldly that, before anything else, he would like to clarify a point. He stares at them with firmness and offers apologies for not having brought his wife to that meeting, explaining in a serious manner that she finds herself very busy managing the farm tasks at the moment. Baron Joseph Wieben loses his patience completely, hits the table with force, and screams for his son-in-law to stop trying to change the subject, demanding total focus on the discussion about the division of the inheritance. The man rails furiously for the young man to stop being greedy and deliver the fortune to the two soon, questioning if he really thinks it is fair to claim those assets after having spent 10 long years away from home. Faced with the incessant shouts of his father-in-law, who accuses him of avarice, Elric covers his own face and lets out a sarcastic laugh, repeating the word greedy with total contempt. He moves his fingers away slowly, focusing his intense red eyes on the man, and asks with a threatening tone of voice what exactly Joseph intends to do in case he decides to act with such greed mentioned. The Baron swallows hard and stammers, startled, while his son-in-law repeats in an intimidating manner the question of what they would do in case he resolved to take possession of all the wealth for himself. The young man challenges his father-in-law to say something and to reveal what his reaction would be, mocking the fact that the man suddenly fell silent right after having shouted with so much arrogance. Without giving chances for answers, Elric strikes the table with force and asks in a harsh manner if the noble's proud mouth dried so quickly before a real confrontation. The Baron trembles and screams, infuriated, while he insults his son-in-law as an insolent wretch. The young master stares at him coldly and confirms that, apparently, his father-in-law finally understood with whom in fact he was dealing. The young man remembers his 10 years of pure survival on the battlefields, recalling that there is no need for exaggerated movements or to demonstrate foolish fury against weak opponents. He reflects that, in the end, nothing will change the final result of that situation, regardless of the meaning he tries to give to his own actions. Elric looks right into the depths of the Baron's eyes and advises him to keep his mouth shut, starting from that instant, warning that this would be the best choice in case the two still want to continue receiving Tyria's financial support. He lets out a mocking smile and comments how he finds comical that entire ridiculous scene created by two people who possess absolutely no legal right over his wife's inheritance. The young man stands up leaning on his cane and turns his back on the two, declaring with authority that the only ones truly consumed by greed there are the in-laws themselves. Joseph screams uncontrollably behind him, threatening to invade the Portman property to end the young man's life, but Elric only answers with disdain for the man to feel free to try whatever he wants. Before crossing the large doors, the protagonist casts one last frightening look over his shoulders and warns that he will be waiting anxiously for that attempt. A short time later, the young master's carriage begins its return journey, cutting through the dirt roads surrounded by trees under the afternoon light. From inside the vehicle, Elric rests his head on his hand and lets out a long sigh of exhaustion while trying to calm down after the tense confrontation. He begins to question himself if his arrogant attitude was really any different from the greed of his in-laws, concluding bitterly that, in Tyrion's eyes, he continues to be only one more selfish sinner. The young man remembers his own harsh words said in the Wyvern mansion and begins to doubt if he really took that initiative to defend his wife from her terrible family. Holding the handle of his cane firmly, he wonders if he acted that way only to inflate his own and distorted sense of superiority. The young man confesses to himself that the feeling that dominated him in that hall was not compassion for Tyria, but a bizarre and perverse satisfaction upon crushing and humiliating his in-laws completely. At that instant, he recalls the imposing voice of his late father, Hovin Portman, demanding in a relentless way that he do his part to deserve the support he received. Taken by a mixture of anguish and regret, Elric realizes with terror that he is nothing different from his late father, being only one more selfish man who thinks only of himself. Suddenly, the coachman is startled by a strange noise coming from inside the carriage cabin and pulls the horse's reins immediately. Elric pushes the vehicle door in a hurry and rests his hand on the wooden side with a lot of force. The young man leans out and begins to vomit violently on the ground, suffocated by a sudden crisis of anxiety and repulsion of himself. Gasping and with sweat dripping down his pale face, he tries to catch his breath while murmuring that he is a truly deplorable human being without salvation. The young master remains there, leaning on the carriage parked on the side of the road that cuts through the immense golden wheat field under the afternoon sky. Suddenly, the soft sound of footsteps crushing the dry vegetation breaks the silence of the location, making him turn in the direction of the noise. Still sweating cold due to physical malaise, the young man looks to the sides trying to identify who is approaching. His reddened eyes widen in complete astonishment upon focusing on a quite familiar figure in the middle of the plantation. He spots Tyria standing in the middle of the vast wheat fields, wearing her simple peasant clothes under the soft glow of the sunset. The soft breeze of the afternoon agitates the young lady's blonde hair, who observes the golden horizon with her habitual serenity. The protagonist mutters his wife's name with a trembling voice, deeply touched to find her in that isolated place. Forgetting his own physical pain in the cane, he begins to walk in a hurry toward her, questioning himself in thought about everything she went through. He runs with difficulty through the wheat field, being invaded by an immense guilt upon reflecting on how much the young lady must have suffered silently in the hands of her own selfish parents. The young man feels suffocated upon realizing that his late father was also one of those responsible for placing that terrible burden on the shoulders of such a young girl. Aldio and little Marie observe the scene from afar with confused expressions, while Elric continues his desperate run through the field, blaming himself for also having been one of the causes of that suffering. He reflects that all the people who surrounded the life of that poor young lady, including himself, in some way hurt or exploited her throughout time. The young man finally reaches his wife and holds her wrist firmly, interrupting the young lady's walk in an abrupt manner. Startled by the sudden approach and the young man's gasping breath, Tyria turns around and asks, confused, what is happening to him. Without strength to remain firm and taken by an immense regret, Elric bows before his wife in the middle of the wheat field, holding her hand while he begins to apologize for everything. Elric begs for his wife's forgiveness, apologizing for having abandoned her completely alone for 10 long years and for having tried to justify his selfish attitudes as if they had been for her own good. Holding Tyria's hands in the middle of the plantation, he assumes the guilt for every trial, pain, and difficulty she was forced to face without any support. The young mistress listens to him in absolute silence, widening her eyes in complete astonishment upon seeing the proud heir admit that all that had been a great mistake of his. This attitude, so vulnerable, brings to the surface memories of the past, when the two were children, on the day that a young Elric wielded a piece of wood to defend little Tyria from a pack of magical beasts. After frightening off the monsters, the small heir turned toward the blonde girl and asked if she was okay or if she had been bitten in some place. The girl answered shyly that she was unharmed, but pointed with worry to the boy's leg that presented a bloodied cut. Upon noticing the injury, little Elric jumped with shock and began to rail, irritated at the cursed beasts for having dared to bite his leg. Embarrassed, The young lady asked in a low voice for him to come closer so she could examine the wound. While bandaging his wound with delicacy, she heard him say proudly that his name was Elric Portman and that he only helped her because that had occurred on his family's lands, dismissing any gratitude. Seeing the girl's silence while she cared for him, Elric asked if she was always so quiet and suggested that she try to please him, boasting that one day he would become a prestigious royal knight. Little Tyria did not say a single word and only continued her work with her cheeks intensely flushed with shyness. Upon finishing the well-made bandage, she announced shyly that she had finished, making the young man thank her awkwardly while looking away. Surprised by the girl's ability, he commented that she seemed like a lady of high nobility, but asked curiously where she would have learned to treat wounds with such dexterity. She whispered almost without sound that her nanny used to care for her in that manner, making the boy complain for not being able to listen and demand that she speak louder. Feeling pressured by his impatient tone, the young lady only shrugged and became even redder and embarrassed. Elric muttered that it would be difficult for her to survive in the world with such a shy personality, warning in a provocative manner that she would never be able to get married if she continued acting like that. Shortly after, he blushed lightly and muttered that, in case he became a royal knight, he could consider the idea of taking her as his bride. Upon hearing that unexpected promise, little Tyria widened her golden eyes and felt her heart race with strong emotion for the first time. Entering into a panic with her silence, the boy began to shout, red with shame, telling her not to boast just for being beautiful and inventing that he only wanted her around for her medical skills. He moved away, stepping firmly and shouting that she would beg to marry him when he conquered the title of knight, becoming irritated for having been ignored by the girl until the last second. Upon seeing him leave in that proud and noisy manner, the young mistress only let out a tender and discreet smile at the corner of her lip. Back to the present, in the solitude of his chambers, the image of that determined and confident young Elric remains kept in an elegant frame. Tyria holds the husband's childhood portrait with affection, remembering with nostalgia the promise made by the boy so many years ago. She smiles sweetly upon noting that, although he never became a royal knight, destiny in some way found a way to reunite them again under the same roof. As the sunset colors the Portman property skies, the housekeeper Rhonda instructs Marie to prepare the tea service for the long-awaited meeting between the masters. The head housekeeper leads Tyria back to the mansion's chambers with firm and elegant steps to the imposing hallways. During the pass, Rhonda comments in a tone of worry that the young master's expression seemed quite heavy and melancholic on that day. The young mistress walks anxiously with her hands together, questioning herself in thought about what the real reason would be behind that call from her husband. Upon arriving before the office, the housekeeper knocks softly on the wooden door and announces solemnly that the young master's wife has just arrived. Sitting face to face in the luxurious visiting room, the couple remains under a tense silence, with Elric keeping his head low in a thoughtful manner. To break the ice of that heavy environment, Tyria takes the initiative and comments shyly that she would like to share something important with him. However, the young man interrupts her in a gentle manner, explaining that it was precisely to tell her something very important that he had requested her presence there. Fixing his expressive red eyes on her with total seriousness, the protagonist pronounces a sincere and deep apology. Tyria brings her hand to her mouth and lets out a light sigh of pure astonishment, completely stunned before that unexpected attitude of her companion. Elric continues his venting and begs for forgiveness for having abandoned her to her own fate precisely on the day of their wedding, leaving her to carry the entire burden of the property alone. He admits that at the time he acted in an extremely foolish and impulsive manner, being incapable of predicting the serious consequences that his thoughtless actions would bring to her life. The young man recognizes all the emotional wounds and the great difficulties that she had to endure in complete loneliness, reinforcing his desire to redeem himself for the past. With a look loaded with hope and sincerity, the heir asks if she would be capable of accepting his sincere apologies. Tyria stares at him with sweetness and guarantees that he has no obligation to apologize for those old decisions. She confesses with serenity that she never held any grudge against him and that remaining in the Portman mansion was a totally personal choice of hers, insisting that he should not blame himself for anything. However, upon noticing the persistent guilt in the young man's gaze, the young lady recognizes that his heart would never find peace if she simply rejected his request. With a beautiful and warm, reddened smile on her face, she declares with affection that she accepts the husband's apologies with pleasure. Faced with the generosity of the young lady, Elric's tense expression finally dissolves, giving way to a smile genuinely relieved and grateful. He thanks her with all his heart for her understanding and calls her affectionately, "My lady." A short time later, the two begin to walk together through the hallway, with the young man utilizing the support of his dark wooden cane. Demonstrating worry, Tyria asks if his injured leg is feeling a little better, and he answers that he is fine, trying to change the subject shortly after. Elric laments shyly for taking her precious time knowing of her so busy routine, but she asks sweetly for him not to worry about that. After hesitating for a few moments, the young lady calls him in a shy manner, awakening the attention of her husband, who encourages her to speak what she is thinking. Totally flushed with shame, Tyria asks with her head lowered if, instead of calling her "my lady" in such a distant manner, with her face boiling with shyness and her heart racing, the young mistress whispers shyly if he could start calling her "my wife." Elric is confused with his wife's inaudible whisper and asks, a little awkwardly, what she had just said. Before Tyria can answer, the hallway door is opened suddenly by the clumsy Marie, who announces with shouts that the tea is finally ready. However, with the abrupt entry of the servant, the young man loses his balance totally, lets out a shout of shock, and lets his cane fall to the floor. Without being able to support himself, the young master falls forward and lands directly on top of Tyria, leaving both in an extremely compromising and intimate position on the sofa. Aldio emerges right behind with a malicious smile on his face and comments in a joking tone that the couple seemed to be quite busy planning the birth of an heir for the Portman family. Completely red with shame and panic, Elric stands up in a hurry while trying to explain to the butler that that was only a terrible accident. Marie enters into despair and begins to shout, asking for sincere apologies for the misunderstanding, while Aldio covers the young servant's eyes and suggests with irony that the employees pretend not to have seen the master's intimacies. The elderly butler gives a thumbs up and promises that he will warn all the other employees to never disturb the couple when the two are alone, ignoring Elric's desperate protests. With his face burning with shame, the young man tries desperately to get around the embarrassing situation before his wife. Tyria remains lying on the upholstery, with reddened cheeks and breathing in a gasping manner, asking in a low voice for him to just get off her for an instant. Before closing the door and leaving the couple alone again, Aldio winks with complicity and wishes for the two to enjoy their time together well, causing one more shout of anger from Elric. The visiting room door is finally closed with a firm click, leaving only the sound of the young master's complaints echoing from inside. On that starry night, Elric's protest, shouts against the butler's insinuations continue to resound through the large illuminated windows of the imposing Portman mansion. The following morning, the first rays of sun begin to invade the young man's elegant room, while the birds sing happily outside. The housekeeper Rhonda enters the young master's chambers silently and asks in a polite manner if he just coughed. Elric, already awake and wearing only a light shirt, wishes a warm good morning to his dedicated childhood housekeeper. Rhonda notices that the young man appears to be in excellent humor and much more disposed than usual, questioning with a knowing smile if something special had happened on the previous night. She approaches sneakily and whispers with malice in his ear, asking if perhaps they could already expect news about a future heir for the family. The young master becomes red immediately and gestures frantically, insisting that Rhonda should not listen to the outrageous gossip created by the perverted old butler. Rhonda turns her back with a light, amused smile, but soon adopts a serious posture upon warning that the events of the previous night should not be treated only as a mere passing accident. Upon noticing the young man's confused expression, the housekeeper turns with a severe look and asks if he really does not understand the gravity of his attitudes. She presses him with authority and remembers that he spent 10 long years away from home, highlighting that the weight of this time of abandonment is much more painful for a young woman and demanding that he does not leave Tyria lonely ever again. Meanwhile, in her sunny chambers, the young mistress rests quietly on her luxurious double bed after a refreshing night of sleep. Tyria wakes up with a tender smile on her lips, feeling that that morning of sun seems much lighter, happier, and special than all the previous ones. She holds the husband's small childhood portrait against her chest and wishes him a good morning in an affectionate manner. The young lady puts the frame back on the bedside table, feeling her chest warmed by the certainty that the barrier that kept her away from Elric finally began to collapse after yesterday's sincere conversation. Stretching with joy under the morning light, she considers the adorable idea of starting to greet her husband personally every morning from then on. The sunny day shines intensely over the vast and productive golden wheat fields that surround the large Portman family property. In the mansion's banquet hall, the young couple settles down to savor the first meal of the day, positioned at the ends of the long wooden table. With calm movements, the meal composed of fried eggs, crispy bacon, and golden toast begins to be served and cut with delicacy. Tyria savors her breakfast in a graceful and tranquil manner, maintaining an impeccable and elegant posture. On the other hand, Elric tries to eat in silence while a drop of cold sweat runs down his forehead, feeling extremely tense and embarrassed due to the intimate accident of the previous night. He cannot focus on the meal because his mind insists on remembering the striking image of his wife fallen and flushed beneath him on the office sofa. Noticing the young man's evident nervousness, Tyria calls him sweetly, making him jump in shock in the chair and answer in an affable and clumsy way. With slightly reddened cheeks, the young lady asks with shyness if, in case her husband has some free time today, he would like to accompany her on a stroll through the property. The young man raises his eyes from his plate and repeats the word stroll with a visibly surprised expression. In silent panic so that he does not misunderstand the invitation, Tyria explains in a hurry that the inspection is necessary due to the proximity of the harvest festival and that the presence of the lord of the house would be fundamental for the workers. Understanding the importance of the event for the family's lands, Elric lets out a warm smile and relaxes his posture at the table. He stares at her in a docile manner and accepts the invitation immediately, guaranteeing that it will be an honor to accompany her during the inspection of the wheat fields. Tyria feels her heart fill with joy with the positive answer and consents with a nod of her head and a beautiful, shy smile on her lips. Hours later, in the mansion's dressing chambers, Rhonda asks if the dress corset is not too tight, and the mistress answers calmly that the attire is perfect. Under the attentive supervision of the housekeeper, the young maids help Tyria adjust her elegant and luxurious dark blue walking dress before the large mirror. Satisfied with the result of the mistress's look, Rhonda instructs Marie to continue assisting the young mistress while she withdraws to verify if the master has also already finished preparing himself. Upon opening the hallway door, the housekeeper comes across the young man already ready and celebrates happily for noticing that he was not late for the commitment. However, Rhonda's expression changes instantly to a look of deep judgment and incredulity upon analyzing the young man's attire. Elric appears dressed with a bizarre pirate hat with wide brims and leather clothes worthy of a road mercenary, questioning with an awkward smile if there would exist any more practical and efficient clothing for a walk in the field. Furious with the young man's lack of sense, Rhonda grabs him firmly by the arm and drags him back through the hallway, railing that he is going to inspect a family farm and not march to a war in bandit attire. She pushes Elric's personal closet doors with force, determined to put a definitive end to that visual shame. The young master tries to protest while being dragged into the room, insisting in vain that he is already a grown man and perfectly capable of choosing his own clothes alone. Without listening to the heir's complaints, Rhonda throws him back onto a chair with authority and orders in a harsh manner for him to remain seated while she provides an appropriate attire of a true lord. Rhonda pulls her white gloves in an intimidating manner and declares that a noble must always dress with the dignity that his position demands, warning that she will completely change his look at that exact moment. Ignoring the young man's desperate appeals, the housekeeper begins to rip off the leather pieces and the pirate hat with quick and accurate movements, getting rid of those bland colors. With his shirt half open, Elric laughs nervously and begs for Rhonda to stop, insisting that he himself can dress as long as she just chooses the clothes and leaves the room once and for all. The woman lets out an amused laugh and provokes him, asking if the young master would be ashamed of her right now, remembering that he used to run naked through the mansion when he was just a child. Tired of chatter, the dedicated housekeeper advances decided upon the heir and demands that he hurry up with that. With a firm pull, she rips off his shirt at once, making the young man stumble backward, letting out a shout of shock. However, the triviality of the moment disappears instantly when Rhonda brings her hand to her mouth, completely shocked and without reaction before what she just saw. Before her eyes, the young man's chest and abdomen reveal themselves filled with deep and frightening battle scars accumulated throughout a decade of war. Trembling and with eyes filled with tears, the housekeeper asks with a choked voice what could have happened to his body throughout all these years of absence. With a serious and slightly embarrassed countenance, Elric begins to button his shirt slowly, commenting that it was exactly for this reason that he insisted on dressing alone. Rhonda approaches with a broken heart, begging in tears for him to tell her what was so terrible he had to face on the battlefield. The young man rests his hand affectionately on the housekeeper's tearful face and promises with tenderness that he will tell her the entire truth as soon as the appropriate moment arrives. With a gentle and somewhat vulnerable smile, the young master asks earnestly for her to keep secret about these marks and not reveal anything to Tyria. Feeling the weight of the young man's silent suffering, Rhonda bites her lips and grips his hand with force to contain her own crying. Recovering her firm housekeeper posture, she wipes her tears and guarantees that, from that day on, she will be the only one responsible for assisting him in dressing, receiving a sincere thank you from the young master. Shortly after, Elric walks with elegant steps toward the carriage where the elderly coachman Aldio awaits him patiently. The young man appears impeccably dressed with a luxurious dark blue gala suit and the satin scarf perfectly aligned around his neck. Upon analyzing him through his monocle, Aldio confesses with relief that he feared the young man would appear dressed as a bandit and make the mistress faint with shame, concluding that his worries were in vain. The young master laughs and confesses with good humor that almost happened, but that fortunately Rhonda intervened in time to save him from a visual disaster. While the two talk, Aldio gestures in respect upon noticing Tyria's approach, who comes walking gracefully toward the carriage. Accompanied by her maids, the young mistress appears stunning in her blue dress, confessing shyly that she made more effort than usual on her look for being the first official outing of the two together. Elric stares at her completely hypnotized by such beauty and, with intensely reddened cheeks, can only stammer that she is absolutely wonderful. Tyria thanks him with a sweet, reddened smile of shyness, while Rhonda observes the scene from afar and decides to keep the secret of the scars upon seeing the mistress genuinely happy with her husband. The heir extends his hand with chivalry and helps his wife climb into the vehicle under the beautiful blue sky that crowns the beginning of that journey. A short time later, the carriage arrives at the busy market of the Portman property, where the voices of the residents begin to echo in a tone of surprise. The news about the young master's return spreads like wildfire among the crowd of the local market, generating a wave of whispers and gossip about the unexpected return of the Portman heir. Elric walks arm in arm with his wife, waving back in a friendly manner and wishing that everyone is well and prosperous on the farm. In the grocery sector, friendly Aunt Michelle recognizes the young man immediately and celebrates enthusiastically, hugging the former mischievous boy who now became such a strong and imposing man. Close to the village taverns, the old local residents also approach happy and surprised, finding it hard to believe that the young man really returned home. One of them notices the young man's cane and questions what would have happened to his leg, making Elric scratch his head awkwardly and answer that it was only a light combat injury, while the peasants lament that the future lord needs so much robustness. Suddenly, an enthusiastic shout calling for Boss Elric makes the protagonist look back with curiosity. It is Bart, the young man's great childhood friend, who runs toward the group with an immense and warm smile from ear to ear. The two friends greet each other with an extremely strong handshake, full of nostalgia. In the middle of laughter and jokes, Elric celebrates that his companion has not changed absolutely anything, while Bart jokes that the boss is so different and elegant that he almost didn't recognize him. The blonde young man greets Tyria with respect, and the young mistress returns the affection, wishing sincerely that her husband's childhood friend is in excellent health. Always very animated, Bart points to his business and invites the couple to stop by his tavern later so that they can drink and celebrate the reunion properly. Hitting his chest with enthusiasm, the Portman heir promises that he will certainly pay a visit to his friend for them to catch up on the conversation. The couple says goodbye to Bart with friendly waves while continuing their pleasant walk through the busy market under the afternoon light. Observing the two moving away arm in arm, the young tavern keeper smiles satisfied upon realizing that, against all his expectations from the past, they form an incredibly harmonious couple. At the end of that productive day, the carriage begins the return journey to the mansion, while the sun sets on the horizon of the vast wheat fields. Inside the vehicle, Tyria remains concentrated on reading a book while Elric observes her in an attentive and silent manner. The young man spies on the pages of the work and notices, surprised, that his wife is concentrated on studying a detailed encyclopedia about botany. With a soft and affectionate tone of voice, the protagonist breaks the silence of the environment and calls for his wife in a docile manner. Tyria raises her eyes from her reading with slightly reddened cheeks, answering promptly to her husband's call. With a welcoming smile on his lips, Elric reveals his desire to start helping her actively in the administration of the lands, asking gently for her to teach him everything about the farm work. Awkwardly, he scratches the back of his neck and admits that she carried that heavy burden entirely alone for too long, expressing his firm desire to act with the responsibility of a true family leader, even if late. The young man guarantees that, if she guides him and teaches him the work with patience, he will become very useful for the businesses, leaving the young lady so awkward that she hides her reddened face behind the book. Peeking over the pages with a sweet, emotional smile, Tyria sheds tears of happiness upon realizing that her husband finally became the mature and reliable man she always dreamed of. With renewed determination, the young mistress closes the botany book with a firm snap on her lap. She stares at her husband with her brilliant golden eyes and, with a look full of firmness and sweetness, asks if he would be prepared for her to be extremely rigorous in her teachings, exactly in the way the late patriarch taught her. Elric laughs lightly in a docile manner and accepts for her to be rigid with him during the teachings. While the carriage continues its journey under the beautiful sunset, the young man asks if his late father really taught her with such rigidity. And Tyria answers with a proud smile that yes, although she never received scoldings for being an exemplary student who learned everything very quickly. The scene then moves to a busy tavern located near the chamber border under the intense glow of the full moon. Inside the establishment, dozens of customers take advantage of the night to drink, talk, and have fun in a quite noisy environment. Suddenly, a person with black boots and red socks enters the place, hitting their foot with force on the wooden floor, and orders in a loud voice for all the fools there to shut their mouths and pay attention to her. The tavern keeper interrupts immediately his cleaning of his glasses and looks in the direction of the entrance with an expression of extreme surprise and confusion. Revealing herself under the torchlight, a young woman with red hair and a dark cloak stands at the door and warns coldly that she will ask that question only a single time. With a gloomy and intimidating look, she demands in a harsh manner for them to tell her where Kasha is, the feared sword demon. The next day, on the imposing Portman family property, the morning sun rays illuminate the luxurious mansion under a golden sky. In the office, the soft sound of a pen sliding over the paper echoes through the environment, while a hand signs several documents with agility. Upon seeing his wife immersed in so much work, Elric asks if she usually takes care of all that paperwork alone, and Tyria answers with calm that this only happens in fact during the busiest harvest periods. Tyria then raises her eyes from her writing in a shy manner and calls him Lord, making the young man ask gently for her to say what she desires. With reddened cheeks, the young mistress questions if he would consider giving a public speech during the harvest festival to officially commemorate his return to the fief. The suggestion leaves the Portman heir quite tense and sweating cold, making him smile from the corner of his mouth while he ponders apprehensively about the idea of making a pronouncement before so many people. At that moment, he remembers his war times when the Parvan soldiers shouted words of order and demanded furiously the death of all their enemies on the battlefield. The protagonist recalls that in the time when he acted as the relentless mercenary Kasha, he simply detested and ignored any type of motivational speech while he rested in silence. He never climbed onto platforms to utter beautiful words and never had the slightest intention of acting as an inspiring leader for others. Elric knows very well that the true reason why he stepped into those desolate war scenarios had no relation to noble ideals. In the end, he marched to combat only because he desperately needed a target to discharge all his aimless rage. Taken by this blind hatred, the young man hacked down mercilessly all the enemy soldiers who crossed his path under the bloody sky. As if he were a rabid and uncontrolled dog, his only objective was to annihilate anyone who dared to stand before him. Upon remembering his old monster's face covered in blood, Elric questions himself if someone so corrupted would have the right to give a speech to the people, until he is brought back to reality by Tyria's sweet voice. Waking up from his gloomy memories, the young man nods in an affable manner and apologizes hurriedly to his wife for having become distracted suddenly. He then suggests with a comforting smile that Tyria herself give the festival's official speech while he remains firm by her side to support her in public. The young mistress accepts the proposal with pleasure and agrees that she herself will assume the responsibility of giving a speech to the residents in this harvest. She smiles with tenderness upon thinking that having her dear husband by her side during the event is already more than enough to make her happy. Later, before a large crowd gathered in the village square, Tyria begins the harvest festival, thanking immensely all the residents for the excellent work carried out throughout the year. With a radiant smile, the young mistress ends her words by declaring officially open the event and inviting everyone to enjoy the party to the maximum. The peasants celebrate the opening with enthusiastic shouts of joy and clap their hands to celebrate the beginning of the festivities. Hand in hand with Elric, Tyria stares at him with affection and asks if they should not also go to have fun and explore the festival stalls. As soon as the couple begins to walk through the busy square, the local residents watch them with deep admiration and comment happily about the illustrious presence of their leaders. A friendly resident approaches and offers, in a respectful manner, a plate of typical food for the young mistress to try. Shortly after, another peasant extends an immense mug of foaming beer and invites the young lord to drink and celebrate with them. With their arms full of gifts, the couple smiles happily and thanks from the heart for the hospitality, wishing a wonderful festival to all those present. While they walk, Tyria's eyes suddenly widen in astonishment upon noticing something very unusual happening in the center of the square. She grabs her husband's arm firmly with reddened cheeks and points excitedly for him to observe the attraction right ahead. On the main stage, a costumed artist performs for the weeping public and announces the beginning of a rare spectacle wrought directly from the royal court. The presenter proclaims in a loud voice that the next and dangerous attraction consists of the incredible act of swallowing swords. The court jester sticks the sharp blade entirely into his own mouth, leaving the young mistress completely shocked with such audacity, while her husband observes the scene with an awkward smile. At the end of the impressive performance, Tyria applauds enthusiastically along with the other spectators in the square. However, upon looking to the side, she notices that Elric remains with a completely neutral and disinterested expression before the show. Upon being questioned if he did not find the presentation impressive, the young man scratches his head and changes the subject, saying that he has just seen many people swallowing swords in the past, hiding the fact that in the war he was responsible for making the enemy swallow real blades. Continuing the pleasant stroll arm in arm, the couple passes in front of a large panel that announces a knife-throwing game. The stall owner recognizes the protagonist and invites him in a loud voice to give some throws, making the children around become extremely excited to see the Lord play. The merchant points to 3 apples hanging on the wooden panel and guarantees that he will give a nice prize in case he manages to hit the targets. Elric smiles awkwardly and comments that it has been a long time since he held a knife, but the boys insist fervently for him to demonstrate his combat skills. With a sweet smile on his face, Tyria holds his hand and encourages him to participate in the game together with the little ones. Yielding to the affectionate appeals of his wife, the Portman heir takes the weapons and walks toward the throwing line, under the happy shouts of the children. The owner of the game asks in a humorous manner for the Lord not to be too nervous, without imagining that the young man's red eyes just sharpened with the coldness of a true warrior. With quick movements and an impeccable posture, Elric throws the blades with surgical precision and hits squarely the exact center of all the apples without the slightest difficulty. The merchant and the children stand completely jaw-dropped and let out a shout of surprise before such a feat. Tyria observes the scene with reddened cheeks, unable to believe her husband's surgical precision. Noticing the general astonishment, Elric begins to sweat cold and wonders if he should have pretended to be a little worse at throwing so as not to raise suspicions. He decides to disguise his extraordinary ability by attributing everything to pure luck, commenting in a humble manner with his wife that he hopes to have done enough not to be embarrassed. Extremely excited, Tyria joins her hands and compliments her husband enthusiastically, saying that watching him throw the knives was like watching the performance of a true knight. Upon noticing that his wife is much more animated and radiant than usual thanks to the festive atmosphere, the young man smiles from the corner of his mouth and feels genuinely happy for her. The owner of the game then approaches with a large straw package and extends the deserved prize to the young master. He explains with an immense smile that the gift prepared by the Guild of Merchants is a valuable basket full of fresh eggs. With extreme generosity, Elric refuses the prize in a gentle manner and asks for the man to deliver the basket of eggs to the local children, who celebrate enthusiastically with the young leader's attitude. Tyria stares at him with a look deeply tender and comments with admiration that he is an extremely kind man. Somewhat awkward, Elric reveals that he was just remembering the past, telling that he also used to win those packages of eggs when he was a child and felt immensely happy upon finding a golden egg hidden among them. With a beautiful laugh, Tyria remembers that the young man used that valuable golden egg to buy a metal helmet of an old knight of the village, although the piece was so immense that it looked like a bucket upside down on his child's body. The young master is totally shocked and widens his eyes, questioning surprised how the wife could know such an intimate detail of his childhood. In silent panic, Tyria stutters and tries to disguise in a hurry, alleging in a clumsy manner that he was the biggest troublemaker in the region and that the rumors about his mischief ran all over. However, she bites her lips and thinks to herself that she cannot by any means reveal the true reason behind that knowledge. The truth is that the little girl used to watch him in secret from behind the trees every day, feeding from that time the deep desire of becoming the bride of that mischievous boy. Bringing her back to the present, the young man calls her in a soft manner to capture her attention. With a welcoming smile on his lips and an extended hand in a chivalrous manner, Elric warns that the post-ceremony party is about to begin and asks if they should follow toward the central square. Feeling her chest warmed by so much affection, Tyria holds her husband's hand firmly and accepts the invitation with a beautiful smile. Under the beautiful starry sky of the night, the festival presenter raises a lit torch before the crowd and announces the beginning of the traditional illumination ceremony to start the party. Before lighting the large bonfire, he makes a point of thanking warmly the illustrious presence of the Portman couple, praising the stunning beauty of the young mistress in an enthusiastic manner. The crowd has fun and laughs at the orator's declaration, while Elric comments with good humor that the man is indeed a quite charismatic figure. The presenter gestures in a dramatic manner to the public and invites everyone to make a prayer in favor of the prosperity and eternal glory of their lands. However, in a totally unexpected manner, he declares in a loud voice that the ceremony must begin with a passionate kiss between Lord Elric and Lady Tyria. Upon hearing the bold proposal, the two young people jump in shock and stare at each other, completely embarrassed and without reaction. Tyria feels her cheeks burn with shame upon realizing that she will have to kiss her husband before the entire village gathered. Meanwhile, the presenter continues giving a speech on the central stage with his torch raised before all those present. The festival host insists once more in a loud voice about the importance of performing that beautiful tradition to bless the local lands. He gestures enthusiastically and summons formally the two leaders to proceed with the expected rite of the kiss. With intensely reddened cheeks and racing hearts, the two young people exchange looks filled with hesitation and shyness. From the middle of the crowd, Bart lets out a provocative laugh and shouts for his childhood friend to hurry up with that, making Elric mentally curse the intrusive tavern keeper. Always very playful, the young tavern keeper encourages the entire public to begin a chorus to give the necessary courage to the young master. In a matter of seconds, dozens of local residents begin to applaud and shout in unison for the couple to finally kiss. Seeing that there is no way to escape that pressure, Elric leans slightly toward his wife and asks for permission for an instant in a docile manner. With a quick movement full of attitude, the young man pulls her by the waist and tilts her gently backward in an extremely cinematic and romantic embrace. He approaches firmly her lips, leaving the young mistress with widened eyes and her heart beating in her throat before such physical proximity. With reddened cheeks, the young man moves slightly away and offers whispered apologies, explaining that he did that only to satisfy the festival people's expectations and make them stop with the insistence. Tyria closes her eyes with a docile smile and answers that she understands perfectly the husband's decision to follow with the festive tradition. However, she pulls him suddenly by the neck in a decided manner and declares that she does not intend only to pretend or fulfill expectations, sealing her lips onto his in a deep and passionate kiss. Faced with such a display of affection, the crowd goes wild with ear-splitting shouts of celebration while the large bonfire is finally lit in the background. Under the spectacular glow of the full moon, the peasants celebrate happily, wishing for the couple's love to be eternal and that it brings endless glory for their lands. Hours later, the imposing Portman mansion rests silent under the mantle of the starry night while silence takes over the hallways. Inside her luxurious room, Tyria appears kneeling on the bed and buries her face in a pillow to muffle her shouts of pure embarrassment. She pulls in air in a gasping manner with intensely red cheeks, almost unable to breathe due to the internal agitation. Her brain insists on replaying the scene of the passionate kiss in slow motion, making her question herself in despair about what on earth she had in her head to take such a bold and sudden attitude with her husband. Anguished with the fear that her spouse might now consider her a strange or too daring woman, the young mistress rolls from one side to the other in bed, unable to close her eyes throughout the entire night. On the other side of the hallway, Elric himself also finds himself totally awake and lying on his back, touching his own lips in a trance while his heart beats in an uncontrolled manner. Meanwhile, in a place distant from there, the imposing residence of an influential noble family rises majestic under the sunny sky of the Kingdom of Armen. Inside the luxurious palace, a hand holds with elegance a sophisticated porcelain cup adorned with golden details. A mysterious man with round glasses and blonde hair takes a calm sip of his hot drink, starting his daily activities with absolute tranquility. Secretary Agnes Blackmire approaches the luxurious desk and informs Edward White that the Imperial Army forces managed to break the defense lines of the Thalbin and Chabor borders. Upon hearing the news, the blond man places his cup back on the saucer and comments with disdain that since Cash's departure from the battlefields, the defenses of those regions began to crumble in an inevitable manner. Officially identified as the Duke of Gold, Edward White, he smiles satisfied and highlights that having the mercenary Casha as the main target of his plans was an absolutely brilliant move on his part. Beside him, with a cold and inexpressive posture, his efficient secretary Agnes Blackmire listens to the boss's words without demonstrating any reaction. However, the young lady adopts a firmer posture and questions if it is really prudent to allow these two regions to fall into the hands of the Imperial Army, since they possess a considerable financial participation within the powerful EW group. Edward takes another sip of his tea and explains calmly that the war of conquest initiated by the Emperor has already lasted 7 long years, detailing that these two localities only managed to maintain military financing until now due to the shares they possessed in his corporation. He turns the rest of the drink in his mouth while he compliments that those lands already lost completely any capacity to pay off the monumental debts they accumulated with the Kingdom of Armen. With an astute look, the Duke guarantees that the definitive fall of the two regions is only a matter of time now that the feared mercenary is no longer there to defend them, highlighting that they only need to rescue important allies and recover control of their shares before the final collapse. Understanding the boss's real intentions, the secretary extends her hand to hold the gold teapot on the table and serve more drink. While serving Edward's cup with graceful movements, Agnes comments in a neutral tone that he is an extremely relentless man in his business. The blond man changes his posture immediately and complains in a caricatured and tearful manner, insisting in his defense that he is only fulfilling his civic duty as an honored noble of the Kingdom of Armen. Resuming the focus of the conversation in a serious manner, the young lady questions if it would be really safe to leave the legendary Kasha free and without any type of constant surveillance. The Duke of Gold lets out a light smile from the corner of his mouth and corrects the secretary, guaranteeing that the feared sword demon no longer exists and that he is now only an ordinary man named Elric Portman. Heinous Mix mentioned that they should have eliminated the warrior definitively from the start to avoid future risks, to which Edward retorts, sweating cold, that trying to kill him in a direct manner would have been a fatal error in case they failed the mission. The blond man remembers that the secretary witnessed Kasha's absurd power in the past, when the mercenary managed to deflect a projectile at the speed of sound using a magical barrier in a fraction of a second, even after having had his knees gravely shattered in combat. He rests his elbows on the table and explains that it would be a tremendous waste to simply take the life of someone with such potential, affirming with conviction that the current outcome ended up being much more beneficial for his plans. Edward comments that the warrior he met was a mercenary of soul and that both belonged to the same type of ambitious people, although there exists a crucial and very striking difference between their personalities. The Duke gestures in a calm manner and reveals that, unlike common warriors who fight strictly for gold, Elric never acted based on his own interests or personal gains. with a gloomy and intimidating look. The blond man confesses that, knowing exactly the young man's nature, he took the decision to keep him under his absolute control and manipulate his actions as if he were a marionette. He points out that, without the presence of the sword demon on the front line, the military conflicts will soon enter an inevitable impasse, forcing various desperate nations to seek the financial support of the EW Corporation. Agnes listens to the explanation attentively and concludes that during this economic and military impasse, the retired warrior will become the perfect weight to destabilize the balance in favor of Edward, allowing the company to accumulate wealth even more monumental. Upon hearing the assistant's perfect reasoning, the Duke of Gold becomes extremely emotional and with eyes shining with happiness for her perspicacity. He jumps from the chair with an immense smile on his face and points enthusiastically to the young lady, celebrating in a noisy manner for her being such an intelligent and sharp assistant. Always very effusive, the young man walks toward Agnes with open arms, insisting that she come to him to receive a strong hug of gratitude. However, his attempted approach is interrupted in a brutal manner by an accurate blow that makes him spit out so much pain. With his fist still closed and a glacial countenance, the secretary passes over the boss fallen on the floor and warns him seriously not to try any tricks with her, guaranteeing that she will not take it lightly only for him being young. Back to the Wibbenlands. The day dawns sunny and with few clouds over the luxurious mansion of the Portman family. In his personal chambers, Elric observes his own reflection in the mirror, while the housekeeper Rhonda assists him to adjust his elegant walking overcoat. The young master walks toward the main hallway accompanied closely by the trusted housekeeper, moment in which he spots his beautiful wife approaching from afar. Upon bumping into her husband right in the morning, the young mistress becomes instantly with reddened cheeks and calls him in a shy manner. Elric also cannot contain his own nervousness and turns around with a slightly reddened face upon greeting her in a hesitant tone. Noticing the adorable tension and the clear embarrassment that hangs between the couple after the night of the kiss, Rhonda lets out a provocative laugh and approaches to stir up the conversation in a relaxed manner. In total panic of shame, the young mistress turns around abruptly and runs away through the hallway as fast as her legs can endure. The young man scratches the back of his neck awkwardly while observing his wife's desperate escape under the attentive and analytical gaze of the housekeeper who is right behind him. Curious about the bizarre behavior of both, Rhonda questions if the two could have fought, commenting that she had been very happy to hear rumors that the climate between them was quite warm during the celebration of the previous night. The young man gestures frantically and tries to explain that everything did not pass of a provocation of his friend Bart, to which the housekeeper corners him with malice, asking if at least the warm part of the rumor was true. Completely embarrassed and with his face boiling, the protagonist decides to change the subject immediately and questions who would be the important guests who would arrive at the fief today. Resuming her professional posture, the housekeeper clarifies that an important commercial delegation coming directly from the Western Kingdoms is about to disembark at the location. Upon listening to the mention of the Western Kingdoms, Elric's look becomes serious and a drop of cold sweat runs down his forehead due to the memories of his military past. She explains enthusiastically that the high-quality wheat produced in their lands attracts delegations from several countries annually, revealing happily that even the powerful kingdom of Armene decided to participate in the bidding this time. Elric bites his hand as a sign of pure apprehension, fearing that some of the foreign representatives might recognize his true identity as the feared mercenary and bring serious problems for the peaceful barony. The housekeeper ponders that the responsibility of welcoming them would be normally tedious, but argues that it would be much more appropriate that the lord of the house assume this role of leadership now, receiving the young man's reluctant agreement. A short time later, the young master appears at the imposing Wibben train station, accompanied by the loyal coachman Altheo, who asks patiently for him not to be so tense with the encounter. The coachman guarantees in a humorous manner that it will be enough to pronounce some formal nobility greetings as he himself taught him for everything to run perfectly well, receiving a sincere thank you from the young man. The protagonist takes a deep breath and tries to calm his own thoughts, rationalizing that none of the surviving warriors who witnessed his fury on the battlefields would come to a peaceful region of the interior only to negotiate wheat. He slides his hand discreetly under his coat to ensure that his hidden weapon is in its place, although he knows very well that there should not exist any plausible reason to utilize it today. Suddenly, the gigantic steam locomotive appears on the platform's tracks, emitting a noisy whistle and announcing the arrival of the foreign delegation at the train station. With the noise of brakes and the opening of the passenger car doors, the first members of the delegation begin to disembark on the stone platform. With an impeccable lord posture, Elric takes a step forward arm in arm with his cane and gives an official welcome to the visitors in the name of the Portman family. However, at the instant he raises his eyes to face the newcomers while offering the property's carriages for the transport, the young man jumps in shock upon coming across a presence totally unexpected before him. The man in the green suit and greenish mustache takes a step back, sweating cold of absolute dread. Under Elric's penetrating gaze, the memories of a bloody past seem to come to the surface in a frightening manner. Trembling and completely pale, the man extends his hands, stuttering of dread, and asks if he is the terrible mercenary Kasha. The scene then returns briefly to the luxurious residence of Edward White in the Kingdom of Armen. The Duke of Gold runs desperate through the palace corridors, accompanied closely by Agnes, complaining that his sister did not alert him of anything about that unexpected visit. He opens the imposing doors of the main visiting hall with haste to receive the illustrious guest. With an immense smile and open arms, Edward greets happily his dear older sister. However, the young lady stares back at him in an impassive manner with an extremely sharp and impatient look. Revealing herself as the greatest shareholder of the corporation and known as the Flaming Flower, Egret Valentina awaits him with crossed arms on the sofa. Ignoring her scowl, the blonde man lifts her in the air in an affectionate manner and jokes that she seems to have grown quite a bit since their last encounter. With flames of pure fury in her red eyes, Valentina demands coldly that he put her on the ground before she incinerates him right there. The Duke of Gold becomes totally trembling with dread and agrees immediately to put her back on the seat. Without losing time with formalities, the young woman with red hair charges for answers and demands to know if he finally discovered the mercenary Kash's whereabouts. Edward scratches his head awkwardly and stammers, saying that the warrior simply disappeared like a ghost, making the task of locating him extremely difficult. Valentina screams furious and threatens him, saying that she will withdraw all her shares from the corporation in case he does not find the sword demon, causing an immediate panic in the young man, who begs desperately for her not to do that. She squeezes firmly his cheek with disdain and orders harshly that, if he does not want to go bankrupt, he must locate and bring the bastard Kasha to her presence as soon as possible. She then turns her back in a dramatic manner, making her dark cloak sway in the air. Valentina exhibits an expression full of determination and firmness upon preparing to depart. She withdraws from the hall, warning coldly that she will not give him much time and demands that he at least discover the warrior's trail, leaving Edward totally discouraged. The imposing visiting hall doors close with a violent thud right behind her. Still kneeling on the floor under Agnes' gaze, Edward answers, startled, that he will never reveal Kasha's real location to his sister, knowing very well that the meeting of those two monsters would cause a catastrophe of continental proportions. Changing focus quickly, the young man stands up and questions if the commercial delegation from Armen has already been duly sent to the Wyvenfieth. Agnes confirms that yes, but expresses her doubts, alleging that a crafty warrior like Kasha would hardly bite such an obvious bait of commercial relations. With a perverse expression full of malice, the Duke retorts that, although the mercenary Kasha would refuse, young Master Elric Portman will be forced to accept the commercial agreement because he prepared an irresistible proposal to save the barony. The scene then focuses on the passenger train crossing the vast and golden wheat fields of the Portman property. Inside one of the luxurious train cars, the startled Lord Polo travels in silence beside a noble with purple hair. Positioned right before the two commercial representatives, the elderly diplomat with gray hair stares at them with seriousness. He exhibits a cold and severe countenance while analyzing his subordinates in an attentive manner. The focus then returns to the busy Wyvern station platform under the steam noise of the locomotive. The important diplomat in a dark suit finally takes his first step out of the passenger car. Elric and Aldio make an elegant bow of welcome to receive warmly the illustrious delegation that has just disembarked. The young master smiles in a friendly manner and explains that he provided comfortable carriages to take them directly to the family mansion's dependencies. However, upon hearing Elric's voice, Lord Polo widens his eyes and becomes completely paralyzed with dread. Under the gloomy glow of the young man's red eyes, terrible memories of the past come to the noble's mind in an overwhelming manner. The merchant extends his trembling hand and begins to stutter with dread, almost unable to utter the words. In absolute panic, Lord Polo begins to shout and retreat, startled before the confusion of his traveling companions, while Elric freezes nervously upon realizing that he had the bad luck of reenacting precisely that man from his past, right there. The protagonist swallows hard and knows that, if his true identity as the Sword Demon is revealed, the entire Wyvern Barney will run a mortal danger, deciding that he needs to hide who he is at any cost. While Lord Polo begs desperately for them to turn the train back to his country, his companions try to calm him down, moment in which Elric intervenes calmly to make his presentation. With an incredibly goofy smile and pretending to be a dimwit, the young man scratches his head and introduces himself officially as Elric Portman, the current lord of those lands. The foreign noble is totally stunned and confused upon hearing that family name, questioning internally if that young man, so clumsy, would not really be the feared mercenary Kasha. Elric laughs in a friendly manner and asks if he is feeling well due to his clear paleness, making Polo breathe relieved upon concluding that such a smiling dimwit could never be the Sword Demon. He closes his eyes for an instant and remembers that the terrible assassin he witnessed in the war past was a completely different monster. In his memories of 5 years ago, an arrogant noble appears delivering a violent slap on the face of a humble employee during a luxurious imperial banquet. The incident causes an immense stir and generates whispers of discontent and disapproval among all the aristocrats present in the large hall. The ladies and gentlemen of high society observe the scandal with expressions of deep shock and indignation before such gratuitous aggression. Fallen on the marble floor after suffering a quick retaliation, the arrogant Lord Polo rails furiously that a worm of unknown lineage should never have dared to commit such insolence against him. Faced with the aristocrat's fury, young Elric Portman emerges impeccably dressed with a gray suit and begins to slowly remove his white gala gloves with a cold and merciless countenance. Without demonstrating any hesitation, the Portman heir delivers a humiliating slap on the noble's face using his own glove and declares that there is no need for more discussions. With a look of absolute disdain, the young man decrees that that serious offense to his family's honor must be resolved in a definitive manner, through a duel. Lord Polo accepts the challenge immediately, taken by a blind fury, ordering in a loud voice for the guards to bring 2 swords so that he can teach an unforgettable etiquette lesson to the insolent young man. During the heated discussion of the past, a strong voice demands that they stop immediately, revealing himself to be Lord Elvis Graham in his wheelchair. Elric interrupts his aggressive movement and looks back with a cold and totally indifferent expression. Elvis tries to appease the situation and offers sincere apologies to Lord Polo in the name of his companion, but the man with the mustache rails furiously that it is already too late for apologies. While the arrogant Polo rails that he will not accept that serious offense to his honor, Elvis assumes a severe posture and orders harshly for the feared mercenary Kasha to lower his head and offer immediate apologies to the noble. Upon hearing the name of the feared Sword Demon, Polo becomes instantly paralyzed with dread, remembering that Kasha is a legendary and extremely dangerous figure with whom nobody should ever dare to cross paths or make enmity on the battlefield. He focuses his eyes on the young man and swallows hard upon concluding that the terrible demon he witnessed in the war past was exactly that relentless creature. Returning to the present at the train station, Polo calms down and tries to disguise his desperate reaction, alleging that he ended up getting carried away without necessity and asking for them to disregard the misunderstanding, leaving Elric quite relieved upon proposing to continue the walk. However, while he walks right behind the young man who smiles in a friendly manner, the foreign noble ruminates with anger upon thinking that the simple memory of that damned mercenary is still capable of haunting him in that way. He casts a look from the corner of his eye extremely suspicious toward the Portman heir. The family's luxurious carriage follows its journey under the stunning reddish sky of the sunset. The elderly coachman Aldio warns the passengers that they will arrive at the imposing mansion's dependencies in a few instants and asks for everyone to prepare to disembark. Upon arriving at the main courtyard, the beautiful Tyria awaits them gracefully beside her maids and gives them an official welcome to the Wyvern lands. With a welcoming smile and very elegant, she introduces herself formally as Tyria Portman and declares that it is an immense honor to receive the prestigious foreign delegation. Noticing the visible fatigue of the group after the long trip, the young mistress suggests gently that they settle in their chambers first to rest and recover their energies. She then turns toward the housekeeper and requests that Rhonda accompany personally the guests to their respective rooms, receiving an immediate affirmative answer. A few hours pass and the darkness of the night falls over the imposing Portman mansion, while soft knocks echo on the door of one of the rooms. Settled comfortably in a red armchair of his chambers, Lord Polo wonders at the disturbance at that time of the night and questions if it would be room service. With calm and decided steps, a man invades silently the noble's room. Polo interrupts his sentence immediately and widens his eyes upon coming across the Portman heir's silhouette before him. Elric stares at him in an extremely serious manner under the room's gloom and declares coldly that, although it is not room service, he will need to disturb Lord Polo this night. Dominated by a sudden dread, the noble slips from his armchair and falls awkwardly on his knees on the marble floor. Pointing his trembling finger toward the young man, he stammers desperate and states that gloomy look confirms that he is really the terrible sword demon. The man's desperate screams echo through the illuminated windows of the property, repeating with absolute certainty that the young master hides the true face of the terrible Kasha. Seeing that there are no more reasons to keep the charade before his old war acquaintance, Elric approaches calmly and confesses that he no longer intends to hide his true identity. Recoiling, dragged on the floor of pure despair, Polo stammers and questions why he is doing that, begging for him to spare him and remembering that he had already offered apologies for what occurred in the past. Elric settles with elegance in the red armchair that belonged to the guest and points out coldly if he is referring to the fateful day in which he humiliated publicly his family. The young man stares at him with a glacial look and warns in a sharp manner that he does not remember having accepted those apologies at any moment of his life. Noticing the man's despair, Elric questions if he plans to continue thrown on the floor and invites him in an ironic manner to sit so that they can discuss some pending business. Fixing his sharp red gaze on the interlocutor, the young master questions if his delegation did not travel all the way there precisely with the intention of buying the wheat produced in his lands. After the initial shock, the two men finally settle in the armchairs positioned face to face in the luxurious visiting hall. Lord Polo tries to regain his composure, although he continues sweating cold under the intimidating presence of the former sword demon. Elric begins the negotiations, revealing in a casual manner that before receiving them at the station, he had a private meeting with the influential Lord Ugil. Polo widens his eyes and questions anxious about the content of that conversation, to which the young man answers quietly that the other noble made him a very interesting financial proposal. The protagonist inquires if Ugil's plan would be to acquire the totality of the Weeben agricultural production all at once. The scene then shows Lord Ugil holding a relucent gold coin while confirming that all the purchased wheat would be later distributed throughout the vast western regions under the control of the Kingdom of Armen. The elderly noble slides the valuable coin over the wooden table, detailing that a percentage of commission would be passed directly to the Portman family's coffers. However, he raises his index finger and imposes a single and severe condition to close the deal, demanding absolute exclusivity in the purchase of all the wheat for his own kingdom. The diplomat stares at the young man with seriousness and expresses his confidence that the current leader of the Portman house will take the most intelligent decision for the future of his lands. He ends his words exhibiting a subtle and ambitious smile from the corner of his mouth upon pronouncing the protagonist's surname. Upon taking knowledge of that exclusivity trap, Lord Polo loses his patience and strikes the table with force, cursing the immoderate greed of the Kingdom of Armen. Extremely irritated, the noble rails that he now understands the reason for the other delegations. Silence, railing against the betrayal of that old bastard who planned to pull a fast one on his business. Taking advantage of the rival's fury, Elric leans forward and proposes in a calm manner that they close an alternative agreement directly with each other, leaving Polo surprised. With a subtle smile from the corner of his lips, the young master confirms the offer, imposing only the condition that the final selling price of the harvest equals the generous value offered by the rivals. Polo adopts a more measured posture and argues that, despite exercising the role of imperial supply officer, he does not possess authority to accept such a high value in a unilateral manner. Elric proposes in an ironic manner that the definitive acceptance of those old apologies from the past serves as the guarantee of the agreement, ensuring that thus no bitter resentment will remain between the two in the future. The two men stare at each other in silence for an instant, measuring strength through the look in the room's gloom. The supply officer tries to bargain and proposes to close the deal for only 60% of the initial value, to which the young man retorts in a calm manner that such a drastic discount would bring serious complications for the family's businesses. Lord Polo bites his lips of pure tension upon realizing that he is totally cornered at the negotiation table. Desperate not to lose the valuable wheat to the rivals, he increases the proposal to 70% and guarantees that the empire will assume integrally all the customs and transportation costs of the merchandise. With a calm and unshakable look of an experienced negotiator, Elric makes his final counterproposal, demanding 75% of the total value under the same conditions established previously. With a firm handshake, the business agreement is finally sealed between the two men. Elric celebrates the excellent deal with Lord Polo, who admits to being impressed by him being the first to achieve such an advantageous negotiation against the Empire. Intrigued, the merchant with the mustache asks why he chose to negotiate specifically with him among so many people. At that moment, the protagonist stares at him in silence with his cold gaze and thinks that it was only because he seemed the easiest target of all. Since Elric could not say that out loud, he only changes the subject, smiling, and suggests that the negotiation be a good opportunity for them to fix the bad impression of their first meeting, leaving Polo relieved. The young man then takes advantage of the friendly climate to say that he has one more last request to make, and the official promptly asks for him to say what it is about. With a calm tone of voice, the young master warns that if after that day any rumor arises that Kasha was seen in Weaven, things will get complicated. Elric assumes a frightening expression and warns in a gloomy manner that, in case this happens, their contract will be rewritten with blood. Completely terrorized by the mortal threat, Lord Polo only swallows hard and agrees immediately by shaking his head. Later, all the commercial delegates gather around a large round table to formalize the end of the discussions. Tyria Portman stands up from her chair and announces with a beautiful smile that her family will officially close the commercial agreement with the Imperial Army. Satisfied with the plan's outcome, Elric applauds discreetly while observing his wife conduct the moment with mastery. While the delegation celebrates the conquest, Lord Polo receives congratulations from a traveling companion, although he still appears a little nervous. However, Edmund Oogle hits with force on the table, completely indignant with the terms presented, and rails that agreement makes no sense at all. The irritated diplomat shouts at Tyria, questioning if she did not hear the orders of the Lord of the Barony, but the young lady only smiles with calm and answers that everything is running exactly as her husband planned. He leans furious over the table and asks if she has a notion of how absurd that transaction is, calling her Miss, but the young lady soon interrupts him, saying that the correct is Mistress. The sudden correction leaves the arrogant noble with gray hair totally confused and without reaction. She positions herself in an imposing manner beside her husband and introduces herself officially as Tyria Portman, the legitimate wife of the Lord of those lands. With a sharp and threatening look, she adds that it's a tremendous lack of education for Edmund's delegation to continue making mistakes about her title on purpose. Feeling the strong pressure of the scolding, the diplomat swallows his own pride and adjusts his collar while he stammers an apology to Mistress Tyria. Seeing the humiliation of his arrogant colleague, Lord Polo cannot hold himself and lets out a discreet laugh to mock the situation. Elric sighs relieved and closes his eyes with a light smile on his face, proud of his wife's firm posture. He then rests his hands firmly on the handle of his dark wooden cane to begin to stand up from the table. Already in the external courtyard, the young master guides his guards to take the guests in safety back to the train station. From inside the carriage that is departing, Lord Polo waves with the contract in his hands to say goodbye to the host. Elric only observes the departure of the negotiators with a serious and silent countenance. The Portman couple remains side by side in the golden field, observing the vehicle moving away toward the horizon under the sunny sky. The young man turns toward his wife and confesses that he now sees her with other eyes, admitting that he did not know she had such a firm and decided side. With her eyes closed and maintaining her habitual elegance, she only answers that she limited herself to speaking the truth. Shortly after, the blonde young lady gives a light smile and comments that he also revealed himself a quite clever man, leaving the husband quite surprised by the compliment. Showing the contract paper roll, she explains that Polo handed her the documents and that the real trading conditions were very different from those announced to the public, proving that they did not end up losing anything. Scratching the back of his neck awkwardly, Elric confesses that the envoy from Armen was too arrogant and that he only wanted to hurt that man's pride, receiving total support from Tyria. The young lady then suggests that they return to the mansion's dependencies, and the young man agrees immediately, walking calmly beside her. Meanwhile, the focus moves to a large yellow flag with the initials of Edward Wibben fluttering under the cloudy sky. It is the luxurious private residence of the young man, the same one who had organized that great commercial exclusivity trap. Suddenly, a hysterical shout of pure despair echoes through the imposing golden doors of the mansion. Edward runs desperate through the luxurious hallways while holding his head and screams without understanding the motive of his plan having gone wrong. The blond young man with glasses cries with anger and rails that he was willing to buy the wheat for a fortune and share the profits, questioning what left Elric so unsatisfied to the point of refusing. He runs toward the balcony shouting out of frustration, while his faithful white-haired assistant tries uselessly to calm him down. Completely beside himself, he struggles in the air and rails that Elric ruined all his perfect plans only to satisfy himself. In the middle of his fit of temper, the young man ends up tripping over his own foot in an extremely awkward manner. He loses his balance totally and falls backward toward the hall floor. However, before he suffers a painful fall, a hand holds his wrist with extreme agility. Edward ends up upside down and widens his eyes in shock upon realizing that he was saved in the last second. With impressive reflexes, the beautiful young lady with silver hair supports him firmly in her arms. She holds him with ease in the Bride Carey style while the dust rises around the impressive display of physical strength. The young lady gives him a scolding for not having listened to her advice to keep calm, making him apologize immediately in a docile manner. A short time later, a dose of hot and comforting tea is served in a luxurious cup decorated with golden details. The assistant asks if he finally managed to calm down a little, and the young man thanks the tea with affection. Already recovered from the shock, Edward crosses his fingers and reflects intrigued that, knowing of Elric's past as the feared Kasha, he would never expect that he would accept doing direct business with the Empire, questioning what the rival would be planning after all. With a calm and analytical look, the beautiful assistant with silver hair suggests that, to discover the true intentions of someone, sometimes the best path is simply to ask in a direct manner. Edward Wibben agrees thoughtfully with the suggestion and concludes that he really will not have another choice but to go question the rival personally. Decided to take an attitude, the blond young man extends his hand with firmness to open one of the ornate drawers of his desk. With a serious and focused look, he opens the secret compartment while he ponders about the next step of his play. Inside the drawer reveals itself a richly decorated gold revolver on a red velvet cushion, accompanied by the thought that they will need an adequate means of conversation for this occasion. Meanwhile, the story shifts to the imposing and luxurious residence of Elvis Graham. Settled in his wheelchair, Elvis gives a warm welcome to Lord Polo, who just arrived from his trip and promptly hands him an important document. The noble with light hair accepts the paper roll immediately and questions curious about what that mysterious message is about. Polo reveals with seriousness that it is a letter sent to him directly by Elric Portman himself, leaving the host quite surprised to hear that family name. With hands covered by elegant white gloves, Elvis unrolls slowly the parchment to start reading. He passes his eyes over the written lines and adopts an extremely serious and engrossed countenance while he analyzes the content of the message. Suddenly, the aristocrat cannot hold himself and lets out a stifled laugh, leaving the merchant with the mustache totally confused with that unexpected reaction. Elvis Graham throws his head back and begins to laugh out loud of pure diversion, covering his own face with his hand. Laughing at the situation, the young man comments that he kept imagining who that Elric would be, highlighting that Polo must have taken the biggest scare of his life upon bumping into the terrible Kasha. Still exhibiting a wide smile on his face, he thanks sincerely the merchant for having gone to the trouble of delivering the letter to him personally. Satisfied for having fulfilled his role, Lord Polo warns that his task there was concluded and says goodbye to start his return trip, receiving the host's wishes for a good trip. Now alone in his office, Elvis looks thoughtful at the letter and mutters that the feared sword demon disappeared so suddenly that he wondered where he had gone. surprised to discover that he had left precisely for the Wyvern lands. The scene then moves to a dirt road surrounded by hills covered in fresh snow, where the echo of sudden shots breaks the silence of the environment. The barrel of a hunting shotgun releases smoke in the middle of the frozen forest right after the accurate shot. A young hunter celebrates happily the success of his aim, while his companions celebrate in the background with shouts of enthusiasm. The young men run excited toward the enormous deer that lies slaughtered in the snow, celebrating that great feat will finally guarantee their promotion to the level of professional hunters. While two of them kneel to examine the prey and discuss the hard work that it will be to drag the animal back, the group leader stops abruptly upon feeling a terrible foreboding. The companions find strange his sudden paralysis and ask for him to stop daydreaming and go fetch the horses soon, questioning if he is not managing to hear them. With sweat dripping down his face of pure dread, the young man makes a sign of silence with his finger on his mouth and begs for them to stay quiet immediately. He wields his staff defensively and orders in a low voice for the two to move away immediately from the prey, generating even more confusion in the other hunters. Trembling with fear, the young man explains that he is feeling a terrible chill in his spine that indicates the imminent presence of a magical beast in the surroundings, insisting that they need to flee from there without losing time. The companion disdains the warning and says that it is obvious that it is cold because they are in the middle of winter, ordering harshly for him to stop talking nonsense and bring the mount soon. However, a violent thud shakes the ground right before the group, making everyone enter into absolute panic from one hour to the other. Desperate, the young man points his firearm forward and shouts for the idiots to get out of the way once and for all, for there is something terrible right behind them. From the middle of the frozen trees, a gigantic and monstrous creature emerges silently and projects its threatening shadow over the terrorized hunters. It reveals itself as a colossal wolf with sharp teeth and eyes that shine in a supernatural blue tone known as the feared Blade Wolf. A short time later, the scene moves to the imposing mansion of the Portmans under a sky loaded with snow clouds. Settled in her visiting room, Tyria Portman listens to the account with an expression of deep shock and worry before the gravity of the situation. The three surviving hunters appear kneeling before her, with dirty and dejected faces, confessing that they fled the location in complete panic to save their lives. Demonstrating her immense kindness and empathy, the young mistress thanks them for their courage in reporting what occurred and suggests that they take a hot tea to calm down, promising that she will talk to her husband to resolve the problem once and for all. She then turns toward the housekeeper and requests that Rhonda provide generous meals and hot drinks to welcome warmly the frightened young men. In the family's private library, loyal butler Aldio removes a heavy illustrated encyclopedia of monsters from the wooden shelves. Walking side by side with the mistress through the hallways, the elderly man analyzes the book's pages and cross-references the information with the desperate accounts of the surviving hunters. He closes the book with seriousness and reveals that the terrible creature sighted in the forest is, without doubts, a specimen of the dangerous Blade Wolf. Tyria questions startled if it really is about a magical beast, and Aldio confirms that yes, although he explains that the species should have disappeared from the region after the death of its old leader. The young lady widens her eyes and remembers that the pack's leader was precisely the beast that left that deep scar on Elric's neck during the confrontation of the past. Faced with that painful memory, a countenance of absolute determination arises on the face of the Portman heir. She assumes a firm posture and declares that she will not allow any resident of her lands to run the same mortal danger that her husband faced, decreeing that she will organize immediately an extermination group to hunt the monster. Aldio makes an elegant bow of respect and guarantees that he will take care personally of the recruitment of elite hunters highly qualified for the subdual mission. However, before he withdraws, Tyria calls him once more in a decided manner. With the conspiratorial and serious look, she makes a sign of silence and demands that entire hunting operation be kept in absolute secret from Lord Elric. The elderly butler is momentarily surprised by his mistress's unusual request, but soon agrees and promises to keep the secret as requested. The following morning, the preparations for the departure of a luxurious carriage are ready in front of the main entrance of the mansion. With slightly reddened cheeks and an extremely affectionate smile on his face, Elric says goodbye to his wife, promising to return as quickly as possible from his business. The couple exchanges passionate looks, and Tyria wishes a good trip to her husband, remaining beside Aldio in the courtyard covered in snow while she watches the vehicle moving away toward the horizon. Worried, Aldio questions if it would not be better to give a previous warning to the Lord, arguing that he may feel hurt in the future if he discovers the truth by other means, but Tyria ponders that, knowing the stubborn personality of her husband, he would insist on resolving everything alone even with his injured leg. The Portman heir looks away thoughtful and remembers that situation makes her remember exactly a painful day from the past. In her childhood memories, little Tyria appears crying desperately while she calls for the name of Elric, who ran toward the danger. In that time, the small young man had placed himself courageously in front of a colossal wolf, with red eyes, wielding only a piece of wood to protect her. Determined not to let her husband run into danger again, the young lady reinforces that they must deal with the beast alone this time and questions if her request is already duly ready. Aldio confirms that yes and presents the 3 experienced warriors he recruited, guaranteeing that they are the best elite hunters of the entire barony. Tyria plans to conclude the hunt before her husband's return, but the elderly butler is startled to realize that she intends to accompany personally the extermination group deep into the forest. Wearing an elegant blue overcoat with fur details, the young noble argues firmly that accompanying the people she sent to danger is her sacred duty as an aristocrat. Seeing that he will not manage to make her change her mind, Aldio yields to the mistress's insistence, but imposes the strict condition that she retreat immediately in case the magical beast appears. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to the busy and frozen commercial district of Weebin, where the residents walk bundled up through the streets covered in snow. Under the snow that falls softly stands out the wooden sign of an old and respectable local clinic. Inside the office, a friendly elderly doctor with glasses examines the protagonist's leg and celebrates the excellent recovery of the scar, affirming that it is practically healed. Animated with the positive diagnosis, Elric questions if he can already retire his dark wooden cane, but the doctor suggests caution and asks for him to continue utilizing the support for some more time. Changing the subject, the experienced doctor focuses his gaze on the young man's neck and asks if the old deep scar of that region left any permanent sequel. The young master smiles and answers in a relaxed manner that he was not left with sequels precisely because the injury was treated by an incredibly talented doctor. The doctor smiles with the compliment, but remembers that it was an extremely difficult treatment due to Elric's young age and the freezing caused by the Blade Wolf's bite, remembering also how the boy's father begged desperately for his son's life. The revelation leaves the protagonist completely shocked and without words, for he never imagined that his rigid father would have acted in that manner for him. The friendly doctor laughs at the young man's reaction and confesses that it was a striking scene, revealing that it was the first time in his life he saw the imposing Lord Hovan turn pale with pure dread. Visualizing the severe image of his late father in thoughts, Elric swallows hard and admits that it is quite difficult to imagine that man, so cold, acting in a desperate manner. Upon saying goodbye to the patient at the establishment's door, the attentive doctor reinforces the advice for the young lord to avoid making excessive efforts in the next few days. The protagonist opens the clinic door and takes the first step toward the street covered by a thin layer of fresh snow. Leaning on his dark cane, Elric begins his return walk under the attentive escort of an armed guard. Suddenly, a familiar voice calls his full name and asks if the medical consultation ran all well, making the young man look back surprised. The young heir widens his eyes in astonishment upon recognizing the man with the goatee right before him and exclaims Luton's name. Luton, who is a great childhood friend of Elric and now acts as a royal knight, smiles from ear to ear and celebrates happily the return of his former captain to the Weebin lands. Taken by an immense happiness by the reunion after so many years, Elric hugs his companion warmly, while Luton reveals that he came running as soon as he received his letter. The protagonist comments on the rumors that his friend had joined the Royal Knights, and the proud young man confirms the conquest by exhibiting with enthusiasm his beautiful sword granted directly by the court. Elric suggests that they leave there to talk and drink in some reserved place on his account, and Luton accepts the invitation immediately, anxious to know what his captain has been doing during the time he was missing. However, the old friend's conversation is abruptly interrupted by a messenger who runs desperately toward them shouting for Knight Luton to deliver a correspondence of extreme urgency. Completely gasping and tense, the soldier extends a rolled parchment and announces in a loud voice that it is a ransom request sent in the name of the Portman family. The news falls like a bomb and leaves both men completely stunned, with Elric demanding to know immediately the real meaning of that cry for help from his own home. The messenger, sweating cold, reveals with extreme hesitation that young Mistress Tyria Portman is the reason for that entire confusion. With a look of absolute panic shining in his red eyes, the protagonist listens to the soldier confirm that his beloved wife was attacked by a terrible magical beast in the forest. Meanwhile, in the frozen mountains of Weaven, the ear-splitting noise of shotgun shots echoes intensely in the middle of the blizzard. Two fierce blade wolves run swiftly through the snow with their blue eyes shining in fury while they advance against the group of humans. One of the elite hunters positions himself firmly and pulls the trigger of his weapon, firing an accurate shot against the beasts. The projectile hits squarely the forehead of one of the monsters, making the immense wolf let out a howl of pure pain and despair. While the warriors exchange attacks against the pack and shout orders to protect Tyria's integrity, faithful maid Marie runs desperately hand in hand with her mistress in search of shelter. Pointing toward the frozen trees, the young redhead spots an old wooden cabin and suggests that they take refuge there immediately. Marie and Tyria run toward the entrance of the old structure while the maid begs for the mistress to enter quickly to protect herself from the cold and the danger. From outside, the hunter commander orders in a loud voice for his men to light the light stones to illuminate the path in the middle of the blizzard. The warriors wield the shining crystals and run in opposite directions, planning to use the magical energy released by the stones to attract the beast's attention and keep them away from the cabin where the women are hidden. The plan works perfectly, and the pack of wolves bites the bait immediately, passing to pursue fiercely the hunters who carry the sources of light. Inside the dark and cold improvised shelter, Tyria and Marie snuggle together under a thick blanket while they tremble with cold and dread. Feeling guilty for the outcome of that hunt, the mistress offers sincere apologies for having dragged her faithful maid into the middle of that mortal danger, but Marie retorts that she insisted on accompanying her by her own free will. Holding the young lady's hands with firmness, the maid tries to reassure her and asks for her to hold on just a little more, for she already sent a cry for help, and the rescue team should not take long to arrive. With a sad and resigned smile, Tyria comments that, despite the suffocation, she would take the same decision to keep the plan in secret from Elric, relieved for not having put her husband's life in risk again. Marie is deeply moved by the dedication and love of her mistress for the young master, with tears of compassion beginning to sprout in her eyes. Meanwhile, under an intense snowstorm that whips the plain, two mounts gallop at maximum speed, tearing through the icy wind. Riding desperately in the middle of the blizzard, Elric is consumed by a terrible mixture of anguish and insecurity, questioning himself why Tyria decided to face that danger alone and if he is really such an unreliable husband in her eyes. While they gallop swiftly in the middle of the storm, Luton shouts for his former captain to try to keep calm, promising that he will save Tyria whatever it costs, and asking for him to just trust in his strength. Elric thanks his sincere friend's support, feeling a little more comforted in the middle of the despair that consumes his heart. In that fateful memory of the past, little Luton ran crying and sweating cold while he listened to the desperate shouts of Tyria calling for Elric. On that day, the Portman heir had placed himself courageously in front of the gigantic beast with red eyes, wielding only a piece of wood to give time for the friends to flee. Little Luton felt extremely guilty for having fled in search of reinforcements and left his captain to fight alone against the monster. Returning to the present, the now royal knight rides with determination and swears silently to himself that he will never let his friend fight alone again. Further ahead in the frozen forest, one of the elite hunters spots the approach of the two knights and waits desperately to indicate his location. Without losing time, Elric jumps from his horse, still in movement, and runs toward the soldier who waits for him in the snow. The young master holds the hunter by the shoulders in pure despair and questions where his wife is, receiving the relieved answer that she managed to take shelter in a nearby cabin. However, the warrior explains that his companions ended up getting cornered after serving as bait to draw the beasts away and guarantee her safety. Relieved to know of his beloved's whereabouts, Elric asks for the soldier to guide him immediately to the location where the other hunters are isolated so that he can save them. However, Luton places his hand firmly on the protagonist's shoulder and prevents him from following forward with that dangerous idea. The knight argues that he must go running to meet his wife, guaranteeing that he will take care personally of rescuing the lost hunters, even knowing that they are dealing with the dangerous blade wolves. Luton exhibits a confident smile and asks for the captain to trust him, affirming with pride that he is no longer that cowardly boy from the past. Elric smiles back with pride and agrees immediately, recognizing that his childhood companion finally became a true knight. The knight then orders for the hunter to guide him to the location of the corner companions, and the two depart quickly toward the rescue. With his heart beating strongly with anxiety, the protagonist turns toward the shelter under the storm and mentalizes that he needs to run as fast as possible into Tiria's arms. The portman heir runs with all his strength in the middle of the violent blizzard that whips the Wyvern forest. His feet sink deeply into the thick layer of fresh snow with every quick and decided step. Protecting his eyes from the freezing wind, the young man rails against the relentless blizzard and wishes desperately that everyone involved is safe. After an exhaustive search, he finally spots the silhouette of the old wooden cabin in the middle of the trees covered in snow. Elric opens the shelter's wooden door at once with a violent thud. Gasping and taken by despair, the young master shouts his beloved wife's name while he sweeps the interior of the location with his gaze. Curled up in a corner of the cabin, Tyria and Marie jump in shock and look astonished at the protagonist's figure who just invaded the precinct. Without saying a single word, the young man walks with long and hurried steps toward his wife. Elric envelops her in an extremely tight and relief-filled hug, leaving the redhead maid totally without reaction before such a display of affection. With cheeks reddened with shame and surprise, Tyria returns the affectionate gesture and asks why he traveled from so far to find her. The young master only presses her body with even more force against his chest, as if he wanted to guarantee that she really was safe and sound there. He moves away a little and, with a mixture of rage and worry in his voice, rails that he is the one who should be asking that question, questioning why she took such a dangerous attitude without at least consulting him. Tyria looks away awkward and confesses in a low voice that she only acted that way because she did not want to expose him to danger again. Hurt with the answer, Elric stares at her in the eyes and asks with a tone of sad voice if she really trusts so little in his strength. Desperate to undo the misunderstanding, the blonde young lady hugs him with force again and stammers that that was not what she wanted to say in any way. The young man returns the warm hug and confesses that he is only extremely happy for her to be safe, begging for her to promise that she will never again face a risk situation alone. Nestled comfortably in her husband's chest, the young lady closes her eyes with a beautiful smile and makes the solemn promise. Wrapped in her own blanket nearby, young Marie observes the romantic scene of the masters with an incredibly cute and satisfactory expression of happiness. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoes from outside the cabin, making the couple move away quickly with expressions of alert. Marie runs to the entrance to check and announces happily that the other elite hunters finally returned from the forest safe and sound. Elric exits the shelter beside his wife and congratulates the group for the quick and efficient work, thanking for everyone's effort in the mission. However, upon analyzing the faces present, the young master notices the absence of an important element, and his countenance changes instantly to a serious expression. He questions harshly about Luton's whereabouts, making the chief hunter look away with evident embarrassment and nervousness. The soldier reveals with hesitation that the knight ordered them to retreat while he would remain alone to face the pack of wolves, leaving the protagonist in an absolute state of shock. Dominated by a sudden fury, Elric hits his hand on his forehead out of so much frustration and rails against his childhood friend's stupidity. Without hesitating, he orders the warriors to escort Tyria and Marie in safety down the mountain while he will return alone to the forest to save Luton. However, as soon as he turns to depart toward the blizzard, a hand grabs firmly the sleeve of his blue overcoat. The young man looks back from the corner of his eye and bumps into Tyria's worried countenance, who confesses being terrified by the possibility of him getting seriously injured. With eyes filled with tears and reddened cheeks, Tyria begs for him to make the solemn promise that he will return alive and in safety to her arms.